Welcome to this lecture. Today I'm planning to do Imaginary Homelands by Salman Rushdie. So this essay really connects well with the poem that we did. That was the poem by Mina Alexander. That was The Blue Lotus. In both the poem by Alexander and in this essay by Salman Rushdie, the writers grapple with a problem that is fundamental to writers who are living as exiles in a foreign country. According to both Rushdie and Mina Alexander earlier, they think, exile deprives them of certain privileges. You do not feel at home either in the place or in the language that you use. You write in a language that is not your own. You use themes, you write on things that belong to a different language in a language that is foreign. And you are situated in a place which you can't call home. So how do writers grapple with that kind of a problem? Mina Alexander said that she has made the whole world her family and all the poets her kinsmen, poets like Wordsworth, Anna Akhmatova, Rabindranath Tagore, and all those poets, Anna Akhmatova, all scattered in various parts of the world. She identifies herself with them with a poetic voice that is universal and that is not confined to one particular geographical area. That's how she tries to negotiate her identity. In a similar vein, Salman Rushdie too says that exile deprives the writer of certain privileges. He has to operate in a language that is not his own, in a milieu that is foreign. But he says that exile confers upon the writers certain advantages. He can look upon his homeland, upon his past, with a kind of objectivity that probably the native writer himself, also the naive writer, of course this is not something that Salman Rushdie uses in this particular essay, but this is what I'm saying, but this is what he means when he says that, a writer who lives as an exile away from his country has the benefit of looking critically at his past. So he invokes the lines in L.P. Hartley's famous novel, The Go-Between, where he uses this quotation from Hartley's novel. It is something like this: they do things differently there, and says that the past is a foreign country. And he compares one's past to the country that you have left behind. So I shall read some of these lines, the important lines in this essay, and then try to explain what the main points are. Actually, the main problem, as I said, that Rushdie here discusses, and which of course Mina Alexander discussed in her poem, is the same. The crisis that exile creates in a writer, the crisis that exile throws up, and how a writer can best negotiate that. Salman Rushdie, as a young boy, he had, I think, his elementary schooling in Bombay and then was sent to London. And he was a person of Kashmiri origin. So this makes him a plural, self. And how this plurality of selves helps him as well as, creates certain disadvantages. Creates certain disadvantages for him. So he begins the essay, Imaginary Homelands, thus: an old photograph in a cheap frame hangs on a wall of the room where I work. It's a picture dating from 1946 of a house into which, at the time of its taking, I had not yet been born. The house is rather peculiar, a 3-storied gabled affair with tiled roofs and round towers in 2 corners, each wearing a pointy tiled hat. The past is a foreign country, goes the famous opening sentence of L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between. They do things differently there. But the photographs tells me to invert this idea. it reminds me that it's my present that is foreign, and that the past is home, albeit a lost home in a lost city in the midst of lost time. So he invokes this photograph. There's a photograph, and in his study where he sits and writes, he's a professional writer. So in his study, there is this photograph of this old house, and it is a gabled affair, means it's a gabled house. Gabled എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ തരത്തിലുള്ള കമാനങ്ങൾ പോലുള്ള ആകൃതി. The House of Seven Gables is a famous novel written by Nathaniel Hawthorne. So it's a gabled affair, means it's a gabled house, and the house had also two towers, and the towers had something like means hat-like structures, and it was all tiled. Means he of course was born into a prosperous family. His father was very rich, and that's why he sent his son to England for studies. And then he invokes this quotation by Hartley, where he says the past is a foreign country and people do things differently there. If you look at anybody's past, our own past, we sometimes see it in black and white pictures. Probably not you guys, because you guys were born in 1990s and you had mobile phones, color cameras and everything in those days. But when I look at my past, means in early 70s when I was born, I'm a bit old, So in those days, how things were, means we used to have only black and white cameras, and that too very rarely in Kerala. Means there were a few studios in towns, but no studios in villages. You didn't have cameras that you could carry around. No mobile phones, of course. Even phones were a rarity. But when you think of that past, you might think that it is somewhere else. It's not this country. It was a different country where people did things differently. Imagine the Kerala of 70s or even 80s with very few cars, with not many tarred roads. Things were all different there. You didn't have, of course, phones. You didn't have so many English medium schools. And the writer Hartley says that it was a foreign country. But Rushdie, being a writer, a migrant writer living in England, he says that for me the past is the real country. For me, past is not the foreign country, because I have been exiled from my country, that is India, and I now live in a foreign country. For me, Rushdie, he says, he inverts that statement. Inverts ആണ് തല തിരിച്ചു പിടിക്കുന്നു, തല കുത്തനെ പിടിക്കുകയാണ് ആ സ്റ്റേറ്റ്മെൻറ്റിനെ. He inverts that statement. Inverse proportion, for example, you must have come across the word inverse proportion. There's a very famous statement by Schopenhauer. I'm digressing a bit, but Schopenhauer had once famously said, one's brain and one's ability to stand noise is in inverse proportion. Means if you are a genius, you won't be able to stand noise. നിങ്ങൾ നല്ല ദിഷണാശാലിയൊക്കെ ആണെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് വല്ലാതെ ഒച്ച സഹിക്കാൻ കഴിയില്ല എന്നായിരുന്നു ജർമ്മൻ ചിന്തകനായിരുന്ന ഷോപ്പൻഹോവർ പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നത്. മീൻസ് വൺസ് എബിലിറ്റി ടു സ്റ്റാൻഡ് നോയ്സ് ഈസ് ഇൻ ഇൻവേഴ്സ് പ്രൊപ്പോർഷൻ ടു വൺസ് ബ്രെയിൻ. ഇവിടെ Rushdie, what he does is he inverts the statement. He says that the past is not a foreign country. For me, the past is my home country, because I have been exiled from my home country and I now live in a foreign country. For me, the present is a foreign country, because I have been exiled from my home country. That's what a writer who lives in exile feels. Then he talks about the house in Bombay, that palatial house where he lived as a boy in Bombay, and how he has been exiled from there, first sent as a student to England, and then later his family migrated to Pakistan following partition. Means initially they decided to stay in India, but later their family migrated to Pakistan, and again he finally settled down in England. So he has been all fragmented, has been cut into pieces. He is part Indian, part British, part Pakistani, and part everything together. A few years ago, I revisited Bombay, which is my lost city, after an absence of something like half my life. Shortly after arriving, acting on an impulse, I opened the telephone directory and looked for my father's name. And amazingly, there it was, his name, our old address, the unchanged telephone number, as if we had never gone away to the unmentionable country across the border. So he recollects, means a few years back, means now he is, when he is writing this, he wrote this I think in 1982 or so. At that time he was permanently settled in England and he had become a British citizen. But a few years back, he says that I had gone to Bombay, and there, simply out of curiosity, he picked up a telephone directory and looked for his father's address. And there was in the directory his father's address plus the telephone number. And it was as if things were standing static in the subcontinent, as if nothing had changed in the subcontinent, because the telephone directory still showed his father's number, his father's address, and it was as if they had never gone to the unmentionable country across the border. That country is Pakistan. And Rushdie used to be a Pakistan baiter. Pakistan baiter means one who used to tease Pakistanis and Pakistani, the country. In one of his novels, I think Shame, he has called Pakistan as Pikavistan. Pikavistan means, Pikavi actually is the Greek word for sin. Pikavi means I sinned. And remember, the British general was asked to conquer Sindh, had sent a telegram to the British Viceroy in India, in Delhi, and that simply read as Pikavi means I sinned. But the Governor General immediately understood that it was a code message, and the code message meant that he had conquered Sindh. Means I sinned, means I have conquered Sindh. That was the message. And so he talks about how it was that he, when he after, means in 1970s or so, it might be, he visited Bombay, and again the same telephone directory was there. So remember, things changed very slowly in earlier times. Now changes are quite rapid. Every day, telephone numbers are changing, addresses are changing, everything is in a state of flux. That's why, people like Zygmunt Bauman, the famous sociologist, has called our times liquid modernity. Everything is changing very rapidly. But this was not how, say, things were in 1970s or 80s. Things changed very slowly. So the old directory still showed his father's address. Then I went to visit the house in the photograph and stood outside it, neither daring nor wishing to announce myself to its new owners. I didn't want to see how they had ruined the interior. I was overwhelmed. The photograph had naturally been taken in black and white, and my memory, feeding on such images as this, had begun to see my childhood in the same way, monochromatically. Monochromatically means in the same color. So he went to the house, that house whose photograph was hanging in his study in England. He wanted to actually go there and see the house. Since the telephone number was there in the Bombay directory, it was Bombay then. It was not Mumbai. It had not become Mumbai. So it was in 80s. So he went to the place, and there was the house. And in his mind, it was in black and white. Monochromatically means in black and white. Monochrome means in the same color. Chrome means color. And nowadays they talk about color prejudice as chromatism. Chromatism is something like racism. Means you have prejudice against people belonging to a particular color. Means people whose complexion is, say, black. You are prejudiced against them. That is called chromatism. It's almost like racism or classism. Classism where you are prejudiced against people belonging to a different class. For example, you are a high class person and you are prejudiced about people belonging to the lower classes. That is classism. And don't confuse it with classicism, which in literature and arts means something else. So I stood there and I didn't want to, just ring the bell and summon the people living there, because they must have ruined the inside. And my childhood memories are sacred. So I didn't want to go inside the house. I stood outside the house. I'm reminded of what Edward Said talks about in his memoir. Means he is again an exile like Rushdie, but unlike Rushdie, he cannot return to his homeland. He couldn't return because he was a Palestinian, and Palestinians were thrown out of their own country. And Edward Said later, after getting an American passport, after settling down in America, means American passport is very powerful. It's considered to be one of the most powerful passports in the world. He again visits Israel, the country that the Jews renamed as Israel. He goes back to his ancestral village, the suburb where he lived, and then goes to his house. And the house was occupied by a great philosopher, the Jewish philosopher called Martin Buber. He rings the bell there, unlike Rushdie, but he was, shooed off. Means the owner, maybe a relative of Martin Buber, his mother or somebody else, said that this is now our house and you have no right to enter this place. So quite different an experience, but very similar. Then I went to visit the house in the photograph and stood outside it, neither daring nor wishing to announce myself to its new owners. I was overwhelmed. And the photograph had naturally been taken in black and white, and my memory, feeding on such images as this, had begun to see my childhood in the same way, monochromatically. The colors of my history had seeped out of my mind's eye. Now my other two eyes were assaulted by colors, by the vividness of the red tiles, the yellow-edged green of cactus leaves, the brilliance of bougainvillea creeper. It's probably not too romantic to say that was when my novel Midnight's Children was really born. When I realized how much I wanted to restore the past to myself, not in the faded grace of old family album snapshots, but whole in cinemascope and glorious technicolor. So I stood there, but that was a changed place. Because in the photograph, it was monochromatic. It was only black and white. But now I stood there in front of that large palatial house, and there were all brilliant colors. There was the cactus leaves that were green but turning yellow towards the edges. There were the red tiles. It was all brilliant colors. And suddenly, these colors assaulted me, because it was so different from the house that was shown in the photograph. And probably it won't be romantic, he says, to say that that was exactly the moment that his famous novel, his magnum opus, Midnight's Children, was born. Because I wanted to restore my past. My past had faded in my mind. And I wanted to restore my past in technicolors. Technicolors means in brilliant colors. In bright, vivid colors, I wanted to restore my past. So, actually, writing Midnight's Children was an attempt at restoring my past. And that precise moment, that epiphanic moment, you might remember what is epiphany. It's a term that has got religious connotations. It means it's a moment of sudden, intense illumination or sudden, intense revelation. You feel the divine presence at such moments. And this was a favorite term for James Joyce, who had, of course, inspired Salman Rushdie. James Joyce, the author of Ulysses, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and many other wonderful works, many short stories in the collection called The Dubliners. So this was a kind of a moment of epiphany, he says. Of course, he doesn't use the word epiphany, but we can very well know that it was a moment of epiphany. And it was precisely at that moment, probably, Midnight's Children was born, because I wanted to restore my past in its entire glory. He describes that dramatic moment, which he says, so the birth of Midnight's Children as an idea. Of course, Midnight's Children is his magnum opus, and it was precisely at that moment when he stood in front of his old childhood house, that palatial house, that this idea of writing a novel first struck him. And he thought of restoring his memory into words, or translating his past into words. And this is, he says, an irrepressible urge for writers who live in exile. Because though it is said that past is a foreign country where people do things differently, for a writer in exile, he says, it's the present that is foreign, and past is the real country. Past is one's native land. Here, he wants to restore that past, the past where he had spent his childhood, and the present from which he is exiled. There's some kind of disharmony that he feels. What he wants is to restore that past through words. He wants to rebuild that past. But then again, he perceives this problem. The problem is that when he thinks of Bombay, he realizes that Bombay is itself not very much Indian. He thinks of himself as an Indian in exile, and his childhood was spent in Bombay. But when he thinks of Bombay, he realizes that Bombay in itself has not been very Indian. It was a foreign city. It was a city built by foreigners upon reclaimed land. Because in his famous novel, The Moor's Last Sigh, he describes Bombay somewhat this. Means Bombay has been central. It has been so since its creation. the bastard child of a Portuguese English wedding, yet the most Indian of Indian cities. To the north of Bombay is North India, to its south is South, to the east is India's East, and to the west is world's West. And then he goes on to describe how Bombay is an insane soup, a Babel of tongues, where all kinds of stories meet and merge. So it's a memorable passage, and I'm just quoting this from memory. So just go and check Moore's last sigh and how Bombay is described. It's the beginning of a chapter, that's what I think. So since that city itself is foreign, and here he himself says that he has become a foreigner because he has spent most of his life outside India, and he too has become a foreigner. Now his task, he says, is to restore into words, or to rebuild using words, his home city, which is actually a city built by foreigners in a foreign country, in a foreign tongue. What we have here is a clear instance of what can be described as Rushdie's belief in a kind of pluralism. Rushdie doesn't, like most postmodernists, believe in what is called singular identities. For him, all identities are hyphenated, polyphonic, multiple. And this is how Bombay itself is. It's actually a palimpsest. It was first a Dutch city, then was transferred to the British, and then became an Indian city. So he says that we are all we all exist in the flux of time, in the flux that is determined by various cultural influences. So there is nothing called singular. And a writer who operates in a foreign tongue, who works from abroad, when he tries to revisit his past, this urge, he says, is irrepressible. No writer can, resist this urge, even at the cost of, he says, he refers to the biblical story of Lot. You remember probably the story of Lot and Sodom. I don't want to go into details, but the story is that, the people of Sodom practiced sodomy, and God cursed them, and the punishment was so severe that the entire, city was turned upside down, and Lot and his followers were asked to leave the city before dawn, and they left the city, but they were given strict instruction that none of them should turn back. But Lot's wife, who was evil, turned back, and she was immediately transformed into a pillar of salt. And here he says that turning back is suicidal for the writer, because the writer has severed, the writer who lives in exile, the migrant writer, has severed his ties with the past. So turning back might be suicidal for him or her. He or she runs the risk of turning himself or herself into a pillar of salt. But despite that, he cannot resist that urge. And they turn back to their old city, to the childhood, to the past, which some writers have described as a foreign country. But when he tries to restore that past, when he tries to recreate that past from snapshots that are in black and white, and when he tries to lend colors to the past, they find that the past is irretrievably lost. And what they have is only broken mirrors. But still, he later goes on to say that these broken mirrors afford the writer a kind of, a particular viewpoint or a particular perspective, which probably the native writer in his naivete won't be able to see. For example, it's said that the words native and naive have the same roots. The native speaker is a naive speaker, means he uses the language without bothering, have the privilege of what can be described as a critical distance. He will be very much immersed in his culture. So the critical distance that a writer who operates from abroad can afford to have is something that is denied to the native writer who lives in his own country. Now he says that though the writer who lives in exile, who is a migrant writer, he will have to deal in broken mirrors. It will be through shards of broken mirrors that he will be looking upon his past, looking upon his country. But despite that, that affords him a certain privilege, because broken mirrors too give you a kind of perspective, a perspective that might normally be denied to a writer who lives in his own country and who has not probably been abroad. So he says that exile both privileges and disprivileges the writer in certain sense. അപ്പോൾ ഇതിൽ പറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്നത് എന്താ പറഞ്ഞാൽ, ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരൻ അയാൾ വിദേശത്ത് നിന്ന് വിദേശമായൊരു ഭാഷയിലാണ് എഴുതുന്നതെങ്കിൽ സ്വാഭാവികമായിട്ടും അയാൾക്ക് പലതരത്തിലുള്ള ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുകളുണ്ട്. അയാൾ പഴയ ബ്ലാക്ക് ആൻഡ് വൈറ്റ് ചിത്രങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് തൻ്റെ ബാല്യത്തിന് പുനഃസൃഷ്ടിക്കാൻ നോക്കുന്നു. ആ ബാല്യത്തിന് അയാൾ പുനഃസൃഷ്ടിക്കാൻ നോക്കുന്നത് അതിന് നിറങ്ങൾ ചാർത്തിക്കൊണ്ടായിരിക്കും. അതിന് പലതരത്തിലുള്ള നിറങ്ങൾ നൽകിക്കൊണ്ട് ഒരു പൂർണ്ണ രൂപത്തിലുള്ളൊരു ചിത്രമാണ് അയാൾ പണിയാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ പണിയുമ്പോഴാണ് അയാൾക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവുന്നത് താനും ആ പഴയ ലോകവും തമ്മിൽ വലിയ ഒരു വിച്ഛേദനം തന്നെ സംഭവിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടെന്ന്. ആ വിച്ഛേദനത്തിൻ്റെ ഫലമായിട്ട് പഴയതിനെ അയാൾ പുനഃസൃഷ്ടിക്കുമ്പോൾ അത് പൂർണ്ണമായും പഴയതാവുന്നില്ല. ആൻഡ് ലേറ്റർ ഓൺ ഹി ഗോസ് ഓൺ ടു സേ, മീൻസ് ദ ട്രൂത്ത് ദാറ്റ് ഐ വിൽ ബി ക്രിയേറ്റിംഗ് ഈസ് ഫിക്ഷണൽ ട്രൂത്ത്, ഓർ ഇറ്റ്സ് ദ ട്രൂത്ത് ഓഫ് ഇമാജിനേഷൻ. It won't be the true India as it existed in my childhood. It will be an India that is true to imagination. He says that there are multiple realities. There is not only one reality. There are instead multiple realities. This is how he countered, the attacks by those critics, who said that he was guilty of sacrilege in satanic verses. He said, what I am writing is a fictional reality. And he said that there has been a category mistake. My truth is, or my loyalty is to the imaginative truth and not to the truth as it was in history. It's a dubious claim, of course, but it's a claim nevertheless. And he says that that's why when he tried to recreate his past, his childhood, he created a hero like Salim Sinai, who is himself suspect. Suspect means he's not a very reliable narrator. Again, this is a postmodern trope. In postmodern fiction, you often come across narrators who are unreliable. Salim Sinai, he says, is an unreliable narrator. He claims, to have so many kinds of gifts. He claims to have the telepathic gift that allows him to communicate with everyone who were born on that particular night at that precise moment. And the gift, is greater in proportion means to the proximity of their birth to the midnight hour. Means people who were born at 12 o'clock precisely on the midnight of 1947, August 15, have greater gifts compared with, for example, one who was born, say, in the wee hours of, say, the 1947, August 15. So he makes such tall claims, and he strikes us as an unreliable narrator. But Salman Rushdie here claims that this was a deliberate strategy, because he wanted to make his narrator an unreliable one. Because the truth of the past, or the past that he tries to recreate, it's not something that he wants to recreate realistically. Its allegiance is to the truth of imagination. And that's what he tries to recreate. And this is what all postmodern writers try to do. The truth is the imaginative truth. It's not the literal truth. It's not things as they happened. So he continues the next section, wherein he describes his experience of composing Midnight's Children. And he says what he tried to do was try to recall his experiences in India, the days he spent in India, in various parts of India as a child. And of course there is Kashmir in it. You might remember those initial chapters, means where the locale is Kashmir, the brilliant description of Kashmir. For example, how Kashmir, like a chicken that is about to break its egg and break out of its shell and emerge from its shell. It's compared almost, to the Kashmir emerging from winter by beaking its way out through the shell and welcoming the resplendent dawn. The description is brilliant, the descriptions of Kashmir in Midnight's Children. And here he talks about how he tried to recall his days in India the days in Kashmir, the days he spent in Bombay, the huge metropolis, and how also, he tried to recall certain snapshots from his memory of Aligarh and Agra and other places where he spent. And of course, Agra was especially evoked because he wanted to write something about Taj Mahal. So he says that all that he could recall he was not capable of complete recall, is what he says. But I'm struck, by Salman Rushdie's marvelous memory power. He says that he could recall those things. He could recall the childhood advertisements that he saw while as a schoolboy he was, traveling through Bombay. But his memory power is phenomenal. There is a story, I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not. Apocryphal എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ശരിക്കുള്ളതാണോ അല്ലേ എന്നുള്ള അറിയാത്തതിനാണ് നമ്മൾ apocryphal എന്നറിയാം. ബൈബിളിനൊക്കെ, it said there are a lot of apocryphal copies of Bible. Means the church doesn't, recognize all the copies of Bible to be authentic. So many of the copies were, so many versions of the Bible were condemned as apocryphal versions. For example, the version by one of Jesus' disciples called Barbaros, എന്നാണ് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത്, ബർബറാസിൻ്റെ സുവിശേഷം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ഇറ്റ്സ് കൺസിഡർഡ് ടു ബി അപ്പോക്രിഫൽ. അപ്പോക്രിഫൽ മീൻസ് something that must not have happened. So there is one story about Salman Rushdie's marvelous memory power, and that was, as a graduate, while he was reading history at Cambridge, he wrote an exam, and the teachers who valued his exam paper, they thought that, he must have certainly cheated, because nobody, they thought, will be able to quote so profusely, and that to such extensive quotations were reproduced ad verbatim. And Rushdie, according to the story, was asked to rewrite the exam, to appear for the exam again. It's not Calicut University, it's Cambridge University. And so he had to write the exam again, but again he surprised the examiners because the paper was so full of extensive quotations and things like that. So here he says that when he sat down to write Midnight Children, he tried to recall the Bombay of his childhood. He says that he was not capable of complete recall, but he could recall a great deal of things, means advertisements, how the roads and the suburbs were, all these things he could recall, and but still, he couldn't fully recall. And it's beyond human ability to recall everything. He says that we are not deities, we are not, superhuman creatures who can recall everything. All that we can get are shards, SHARDS. Shards means broken pieces, shards of mirrors. He earlier, itself, he had said that what a writer in exile has to deal with is in broken mirrors. And he goes on to say that though he tried his level best, he couldn't recall everything. He could only recall broken pictures. John Fowles, now he invokes John Fowles, the famous British author, who has written the famous novel called The French Lieutenant's Woman. That is considered to be an epochal work, and understand it's considered to be one of the first postmodern works, though some critics say that it's a work that represents, a transitory stage between modernism and postmodernism. But anyhow, John Fowles is such an important author. John Fowles, in one of his works, he quotes the work, has said, there is Daniel Martin. He begins with the words, whole sight or all the rest is desolation. Means either you have to have the whole thing, or you shouldn't be satisfied with the parts, or otherwise it is desolation. It is utter emptiness. Desolation means utter emptiness. A desolate place is, for example, a bleak and an empty place. So John Fowles, in his famous novel Daniel Martin, of course not as famous as his magnum opus, that is what I said, that is The French Lieutenant's Woman. So in that, so Daniel Martin begins with the lines, whole sight or all the rest is desolation. Means either it should be the whole thing, or whatever you get, the scraps, the bits and pieces you get, the shards that you get, that's all desolation. That, resembles a bleak, lonely landscape. But Rushdie begs to differ with John Fowles. He says that as humans, as mortals, We don't have the privilege of being on the Olympus. And Olympus, is the biggest mountain peak in Greece. We don't have the Olympian vision. We can't see everything. As mortals, we always have to satisfy ourselves with broken images. So this is, he admits, true not only of writers like him who operate in a foreign language from a foreign country. This is, he says, true of even native writers, because past, here he partially admits what he earlier had refuted. Earlier he had said that for writers like him operating abroad, the statement that past is a foreign country is not true, because for writers like him, it is present that is a foreign country, because they are living in exile, and past for them is home country. But here he sort of self-contradicts himself by saying that actually past is something from which we are all exiled. All writers, all human beings are exiled from past. That's why many writers say childhood was actually a paradise from which, like Adam and Eve, we have all been exiled. So that's the motive of exile that's operating here. And now I shall explain it. I shall read parts of it and then try to explain this to you. But there is a paradox here. The broken mirror may actually be as valuable as the one which is supposedly unflawed. There is a paradox here. There is a contradiction here. The broken mirror may actually be as valuable as one which is supposedly unflawed. Unflawed means without any flaws. The broken shards of the mirror might be as good or sometimes better. However, it is as valuable, he says, as the mirror that has no flaws. Let me again try to explain this from my own experience. Before beginning Midnight's Children, I spent many months trying simply to recall as much of the Bombay of the 1950s and 1960s as I could. And not only Bombay, Kashmir too, and Delhi and Aligarh, which in my book I have moved to Agra to heighten a certain joke about Taj Mahal. I was genuinely amazed by how much came back to me. I found myself remembering what clothes people had worn on certain days, and school scenes and whole passages of Bombay dialogue verbatim. Or so it seemed. Verbatim means exactly. So he is surprised at his own ability to recall. He could recall the kind of clothes that people wore, the kind of, dialogue that people had spoken with each other. All these things he could remember, he could recall perfectly. And he himself was surprised by his ability to recall. And Midnight's Children moves from place to place. Part of it takes place in Kashmir, part of it in Agra, and part of it in Bombay. I even remembered advertisements, film posters, the neon jeep sign on Marine Drive, toothpaste ads for Binaka and for Colinos, and a footage over the local railway line which bore on one side the legend, Esso puts a tiger in your tank. Esso puts a tiger in your tank. ഇപ്പം പലതും ഓർക്കാൻ കഴിഞ്ഞു. എത്രത്തോളം പറഞ്ഞാൽ അക്കാലത്ത് പ്രചാരത്തിലുണ്ടായിരുന്ന ടൂത്ത് പേസ്റ്റുകളുടെ പരസ്യം, അത് കോളിനോസ് എന്നൊരു ബ്രാൻഡ് ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ബിനാക്ക, ഇറ്റ്സ് സ്റ്റിൽ ദർ, ബട്ട് ഐ തിങ്ക് ഇറ്റ്സ് നൗ കോൾഗേറ്റ് ബിനാക്ക, കോൾഗേറ്റ് സിബാക്ക, which is owned by the conglomerate Colgate. So what he says that he could recall all this, and he could even remember those billboards. And one of the billboards was something like this: Esso puts a tiger in your tank. Esso is a kind of probably, that's what I guess, it's a kind of oil used in vehicles. അത് ഉപയോഗിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരു നരിയെ ടാങ്കിലിട്ട് പോലെ കൊണ്ടാണ്, it will give extra energy to your vehicle. And on the other, the curiously contradictory admonition, drive like hell and you will get there. Drive like hell. Hell എന്നുള്ള പ്രയോഗം നിങ്ങൾക്ക് അറിയാലോ മലയാളത്തിൽ. ഇറ്റ്സ് എ ഹെൽ ഓഫ് എ പ്ലെയർ, ഇറ്റ്സ് എ ഹെൽ ഓഫ് എ മൂവി എന്നൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഗംഭീരമാണ്, അടിച്ച് പൊളിച്ച് ഓടിക്കൂ. ഹെൽ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അടിച്ച് പൊളിച്ച് ഓടിക്കൂ. ഡ്രൈവ് ലൈക്ക് ഹെൽ ആൻഡ് യു വിൽ സെർട്ടൻലി ഗെറ്റ് ദർ. നിങ്ങൾ എന്തായാലും അവിടെ എത്തും. ഓൾ സോങ്സ് കെയിം ബാക്ക് ടു മീ ഫ്രം നോവർ. Means he had long forgotten those songs, but from nowhere, when he sat down to write Midnight's Children, those snatches of old songs came back to him. And remember, I am reminded of what Sigmund Freud said. Sigmund Freud, the great psychologist and psychiatrist, had said, Means he had learned certain languages when he was a child, and he completely forgot those languages. But later, using certain psychoanalytic, psychotherapic methods, he could not relearn, you can say, but he could regain his command over those languages he had once learned as a child and then completely forgotten. So this is something similar. He had completely forgotten some of those advertisements, some of the catchphrases, but now when he sat to write about his childhood that he spent in Bombay, he could vividly recall all those things. All the songs came back to me from nowhere, a street entertainer's version of Goodnight Ladies, and from the full Mr., a very appropriate source for my narrator to have used the hit number Mera Juta Hai Japani. You know, all of you might know that song, Mera Juta Hai Japani. That's a famous number, and he could even recall all those songs years later, now living in London and sitting in his study to write about his childhood. He could recall those things which he thought he had completely forgotten, which could almost be Salim's theme song. It could almost be Salim's theme song because, Meri Juta Hai Japani, some of you might remember those names, number, that famous film song, where, I shall try to get how the song is. Now, what the song says, of course, is that the man says his shoes or his chappals, his slippers are from Japan, and his coat or trousers are from England, and his hat is from Russia. But despite everything, despite all that, his heart is Indian. He says that he can still use it. This can be considered to be the theme song of Salim's entire narrative. Means Salim, despite being displaced, despite having an English education, despite working in a language that is, different, means he's narrating his story in English and not in any Indian language, is still very much Indian. His heart is very much Indian. That is actually the theme song of the entire Midnight Children. Let's carry on. I knew that I had tapped a rich seam, but the point I want to make is that, of course, I am not gifted with a total recall. And it was precisely the partial nature of these memories, their fragmentation, that made them so evocative for me. The shards of memory acquired greater status, greater resonance, because they were remains. Fragmentation made trivial things seem like symbols, and the mundane acquired numinous qualities. And he says that because I couldn't recall everything, the parts, the pieces, the shards of mirrors, that I could recall acquired a special symbolic meaning. And through that process, the mundane, the ordinary acquired a kind of numinous meaning, a kind of metaphysical meaning. There is an obvious parallel here with archaeology. The broken parts of antiquity, from which the past can sometimes but always provisionally be reconstructed, are exciting to discover, even if they are pieces of the most quotidian objects. Quotidian means ordinary. So here he says there is, of course, a parallel with archaeology, because for archaeologists, there might be, when they dig, what they might be coming across might be quotidian objects. Means, for example, a vessel, or probably a seal that Mohenjo-daro people used or Harappa people used, but it acquires a symbolic meaning. Similarly, for a person living abroad who thinks that he has been exiled from the past, for him, whatever he can recall, those trivial events might acquire a kind of symbolic meaning. So it's something like archaeology. Again, I would like to tell you that this is something drawn from Freud. Freud also compares our mind, to the memories in it. He says that they are all repressed. and they are never lost. And he compares to our mind to a city, means that has been built over and over again. For example, on the ruins of one city you have another city. For example, we can say, for example, a city like Delhi has been built, the modern Delhi has been built on the ruins of the old Delhi. And the old Delhi of the Mughal Delhi was probably built on the ruins of Hastinapura. Then on the ruins, it's almost like a palimpsest. Means you draw something on a piece of paper, draw something over it, and again draw it. That is what you call a palimpsest. Again, so the metaphor here is drawn, has got some Freudian connection. It may be argued that the past is a country from which we have all emigrated, that its loss is part of our common humanity, which seems to me self-evidently true. But I suggest that the writer who is out of his country and even out of language may experience this loss in an intensified form. It is made more concrete for him by the physical fact of discontinuity, of his present being in a different place from the past, of his being elsewhere. This may enable him to speak properly and concretely on a subject of universal significance and appeal. But let me go further. The broken glass is not merely a mirror of nostalgia. It is also, I believe, a useful tool with which to work in the present. Now he admits that it's not only writers who live in exile, like him, and writers who operate in a different language who are exiles. All of us are exiles from our childhood paradise. We have all been banished from the paradise called childhood, the period of innocence, the period of joy, or whatever, as some people say. Of course, Freudians disagree with the notion that childhood is a period of innocence. But he says that the writer who operates in a foreign language, who is a physical exile from his native land, feels this experience more intensely, unlike a writer who lives in his own country. Because for the writer who lives in exile, a definitive rupture has taken place. A definitive rupture means a definitive break has taken place. Now he goes on to quote John Fowles. John Fowles begins Daniel Martin with the words, "Whole sight or all the rest is desolation." But human beings do not perceive things whole. We are not deities but wounded creatures, cracked lenses, capable only of fractured perceptions, partial beings, in all the senses of that phrase. Meaning is a shaky edifice we build out of scraps, dogmas, childhood injuries, newspaper articles, chance remarks, old films, small victories, people hated, people loved. Perhaps it is because our sense of what is the case is constructed from such inadequate materials that we defend it so fiercely, even to death. Now, John Fowles, as I said, had said in his book, Daniel Martin, that we want the whole sight, and without the whole, it's going to be only desolation. The pieces, they are of no value. He was dismissive about a vision that is not whole. But Rushdie disagrees with John Fowles and says that we are not deities, we are not superhuman creatures. A deity probably flying above on top of the earth might be able to see the whole thing, but we can only have partial view of things. We can only see things in broken fragments is all that we can see. We can never see the whole picture. But such a thing, such a partial view, or the fragments that we are able to retrieve from memory, or the partial view that things afford us, that has its own value. That's what Rushdie here says. The Fowles position seems to me a way of succumbing to the guru illusion. Writers are no longer sages, dispensing the wisdom of centuries. And those of us who have been forced by cultural displacement to accept the provisional nature of all truths, all certainties have perhaps had modernism forced upon us. We can lay claim to Olympus and are thus released to describe our worlds in the way in which all of us, whether writers or not, perceive it from day to day. Now he says, John Fowles, such a claim means either you have to have the whole picture or it's of no value, comes from a kind of illusion. That's called the guru illusion, because in ancient times, writers were considered to be like sages, dispensing wisdom, talking about things of which they alone possess the knowledge. But now he says that writers too are like other human beings. We can only see fragments. The whole picture is something we can't see. It is the privilege of superhuman creatures to see things as a whole. So false, this very position comes from a kind of illusion, the illusion which Rushdie terms as guru illusion. All that we can have, Rushdie says, is a partial vision, and writers are not unlike common men in this regard. In Midnight Children, my narrator Salim uses at one point the metaphor of a cinema screen to discuss this business of perception. Suppose yourself in a large cinema, sitting at first in the back row and gradually moving up until your nose is almost pressed against the screen. Gradually the stars' faces dissolve into dancing grain. Tiny details assume grotesque proportions. It becomes clear that the illusion itself is reality. The movement towards the cinema screen is a metaphor for the narrator's movement through time towards the present, and the book itself, as it nears contemporary events, quite deliberately loses deep perspective, becomes more partial. I wasn't trying to write about, for instance, the emergency in the same way as I wrote about events half a century earlier. I felt it would be dishonest to pretend, when writing about the day before yesterday, that it was possible to see the whole picture. I showed certain blobs and slabs of the scene. Now, what he says is, in Midnight Children, he uses a metaphor where, the Salim Sinha is going, means from the back row of the cinema, he advances somewhere towards the screen. And the moment, he almost presses his nose against the screen. But all that he can see is fragments. Means fragmentary vision is only possible. Especially, he says, as he said in the earlier paragraph, this is only what is possible for writers who live in exile. That is what he says, that modernism has been foisted upon us or forced upon us. Means one of the central credos of modernism itself is called fragmentary vision. Modernism believes that, all the meta-narratives have had their day. Now you can't have any longer any meta-narratives. What is meta-narratives? Means things that explain the whole truth is what critics mean by meta-narratives. For example, religion is a meta-narrative. Even science, some people say, is a meta-narrative. It tries to explain the whole truth. For example, religions, they say how men were created and what's going to be the destiny of men, how some people, the virtuous people, are going to enter heaven, how the wicked are going to enter hell. So religion has got a perspective, a holistic perspective about things. It's not fragmentary. But modernism believed that the time of meta-narratives is over, and now we can have only fragmented vision. Rushdie, as a writer in exile, says that modernism was thrust upon such writers, and he uses the metaphor which he used in Midnight Children, where you have Salim Sinha moving towards the screen, and as he moves closer and closer, his vision becomes more blurred. And that's why he says that things that are closer, because in the book he wrote about events that took place 50 or 60 years back, and also he wrote about emergency that was happening when he was writing his work. But with emergency, he couldn't afford to maintain that kind of a critical distance because it was very close. Things that happened today or things that happened yesterday are so close to you that you are not in a position to maintain any critical distance from such events. That actually blurs the vision, is what he says. You can't look at things objectively, things that are quite close to you objectively. It's like looking at a screen from just beneath it, pressing your nose to the screen, your vision is blurred. From a distance only you can have the proper vision, but even from there, the vision, the view that you have is fragmented. This is what Rushdie says in this part of the essay. In the next section, Rushdie talks about a novelist's vocation, that is primarily one of describing things, describing the world. And he says that this very vocation that's describing is political, because it's the battle that memory launches against power. Means there's an official version of reality, a version that is presented by the authorities, and what the writer is engaged in is challenging that official version. And in this sense, he says that describing itself is a political activity. And he goes on to question the legitimacy of such descriptions, especially if it is a description offered by a writer who lives abroad and is consequently safe or at a safer distance from the actual political events in the country that he left behind. But Rushdie disagrees, saying that a writer's credibility or rather validity is not to be assessed by his personal credentials, but rather a writing is something that is true to itself. It's not looking at a writer's personal credentials that a work of art should be assessed. A work of art should explore the farthest limits, and it is in exploring these farthest limits that a work tries to be true to itself, and it's not using the writer's personal credentials as the yardsticks that one has to judge a work of art. He also talks about the competing realities that a place has. For example, he quotes the American writer Richard Wright, who is the author of the famous Invisible Man. And he says that the American blacks have got their own version of realities, which is not exactly the same as that of the white version of things. So the writer's task is to present his version of reality. Then he talks about his hero, Selim Sinai, who is almost an alter ego of the author himself. He says that Selim Sinai is very much a secular person. He embodies within him the polyphonic nature of the city called Bombay, which is very much, he says, a secular city. And this is, he says, what he admires about India. It's not a theocratic country. It's a country that is very much secular in spirit. And there he tries to present his version of realities. And he says that writers who live in exile, be it Rushdie, be it Grass, means Gundar Grass, be it any other writer, for example, like Milan Kundera, they all, he says, are heirs to multiple traditions. They have won the indigenous tradition which they must have left behind, and they also are part of the tradition of the host country. So they are people who embody multiple traditions, and they have the right to borrow freely, to use either of these traditions of which they are part for their creative purposes. This is what he explains in his this part of the essay. I shall just read parts of it and then try to explain. I once took part in a conference on modern writing at New College, Oxford. Various novelists, myself included, were talking earnestly of such matters as the need for new ways of describing the world. Then the playwright Howard Brenton suggested that this might be a somewhat limited aim. Does literature seek to do no more than to describe? Flustered, all the novelists at once began talking about politics. Let me apply Brenton's question to the specific case of Indian writers in England writing about India. Can they do no more than describe from a distance the world that they have left? Or does the distance open any other doors? Now, he talks about a conference he attended at Oxford, and there were various writers, and they were all talking about finding new ways of describing the world. How to describe the world has always been a problem for writers. Means they always try to find new ways of describing the world. You had various literary movements. Romanticism was there, realism was there, modernism was there, postmodernism was there. Within modernism itself, you had futurism, so many isms. All these, propounded various ways of describing the world, and none was found to be perfect. Now, at this conference again, there was this question of how to describe the world. And then there was the famous playwright Brenton, who said that writers' role, their role as artists, go beyond describing the world. It shouldn't be not simply to describe the world, but They have to do more than describing the world. Now, Rushdie discusses that. Let's carry on. These are, of course, political questions and must be answered at least partly in political terms. I must say first of all that description itself is a political act. The black American writer Richard Wright once wrote that black and white Americans were engaged in a war over the nature of reality. Their descriptions were incompatible. So it is clear that redescribing a world is the necessary first step towards changing it, and particularly at times when states take reality into its own hands and sets about distorting it, altering the past to fit its present needs. Then the making of the alternative realities of art, including novel of memory, becomes politicized. The struggle of man against power, Milan Kundera has written, is a struggle of memory against forgetting. Writers and politicians are natural rivals. Both groups try to make the world in their own image. They fight for the same territory, and the novel is one way of denying the official politicians' version of truth. Now, despite the objection that Brenton had raised, Rushdie says that description itself is a political act, as Richard Wright, the famous black American writer, had said, because the reality that the black Americans perceive is not the same reality as the whites perceive. Because as Santayana, the famous philosopher, famously said, America is considered to be a land of the free, even when it is all covered with slaves. For the black men, the reality of America is slavery. Richard Wright himself had said, "O America, it is to thee I raise my song, thou boasted land of liberty, thou land of blood and wrong and crime." So for the black American, America is a land of blood, it's a land of wrongs, it's a land of crimes. But this is not the version of America presented by the white writer. Now here what Rushdie says is, the versions, there are various versions, and of authorities, the rulers, they always try to distort the past to fit their present expediencies. What writers should do is to come up with their own version of reality, the alternative version of reality. And in this sense, he says, writers and politicians are natural antagonists. രാഷ്ട്രീയക്കാരെന്താ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്? വർത്തമാനത്തിൻ്റെ ആവശ്യങ്ങൾക്കനുസരിച്ച്, വർത്തമാന കാലഘട്ടത്തിൻ്റെ ആവശ്യത്തിനനുസരിച്ച് അവർ ഒരു രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ചിത്രം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാവിയുടെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വർത്തമാനത്തിൻ്റെ ചിത്രം ലോകത്തിനു മുമ്പിൽ സമർപ്പിക്കുവാനാണ് രാഷ്ട്രീയക്കാർ ശ്രമിക്കാറുള്ളത്. ഇപ്പോഴും തന്നെ ഇപ്പം നമ്മൾ നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ കോവിഡ് പ്രതിസന്ധിയുടെ കാലം നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, കോവിഡ് പ്രതിസന്ധി ഒരു പ്രതിസന്ധിയല്ല എന്ന്, ഇന്ത്യ രാജ്യം അതിനു വേണ്ട എല്ലാ സംവിധാനങ്ങളും ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട് എന്നാണ് അധികാരികളുടെ ഭാഷ്യം. പക്ഷെ അതായിരിക്കില്ല ചിലപ്പോൾ യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഷ. ആ യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാഷ്യം വിവരിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ ജോലി. ഇത് വിവരിക്കുന്നതിലൂടെ തന്നെ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ ചെയ്യുന്ന എന്താണ്? ഒരു രാഷ്ട്രീയമായ നടപടിയാണ്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ചരിത്രത്തിനെ കുറിച്ച് രാഷ്ട്രീയക്കാരൻ പറയുന്നത് അവൻ്റെ ആവശ്യത്തിന് ഉതകുന്ന ഒരു ചരിത്ര വീക്ഷണമായിരിക്കും. ചിലർ എല്ലാം വിദേശികളാണ്, ചിലരെല്ലാം വിദേശത്തു നിന്ന് വന്നവരാണ്, നമ്മൾ മുമ്പേ ഇവിടെ ഉള്ളവരാണ്, ചില ആളുകൾ ഇവിടെ മുമ്പേ ഉള്ളവരാണ്, ചില ആളുകൾ വിദേശത്ത് നിന്ന് വന്നവരാണ്, അവരുടെ മതം വിദേശ മതമാണ്, ചില മതങ്ങൾ വിദേശത്ത് നിന്ന് വന്ന ആക്രമികളാണ്. ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു പ്രത്യേക ചരിത്ര വിഭാവന ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഭരണാധികാരികൾ നമുക്ക് മേൽ അടിച്ചേൽപ്പിക്കുമ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു മറുപുറം പറയുക എന്നുള്ളത്, മറുസത്യം പറയുക എന്നുള്ളത് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ കർത്തവ്യമാണെന്നാണ് ഇവിടെ സൽമാൻ റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. അത് തന്നെ ഒരു രാഷ്ട്രീയമായ നടപടിയാണെന്നും അദ്ദേഹം പറയുന്നു. The state truth about war in Bangladesh, for instance, is that no atrocities were committed by the Pakistani army in what was then East Wing. This version is sanctified by many persons who would describe themselves as intellectuals. And the official version of emergency in India was well expressed by Mrs. Gandhi in a recent BBC interview. She said that there were some people around who claimed that bad things had happened during the emergency, forced sterilization, things like that. But she stated this was all false. Nothing of this type had ever occurred. The interviewer, Mr. Robert Key, did not probe this statement at all. Instead, he told Mrs. Gandhi and the Panorama audience that she had proved many times over her right to be called a Democrat. Now he talks about the official truth. The Pakistani official truth is that the Pakistani soldiers behaved decently in East Bengal and they didn't rape women there. That is the official version. There was no oppression of the East Pakistanis in what is now Bangladesh. Is the official Pakistani version about the Pakistani rule in East Bengal. Similarly, about emergency, Mrs. Gandhi herself said that there has been some campaign, there has been some propaganda, she says, that there was forced sterilization, there were other such things. But Mrs. Gandhi flatly denies such things, and even the BBC interviewer, endorsed her view, saying that she was a Democrat. But this is only one version. This is the official version. And the task of the writer, Salman Rushdie says, is very political, is giving the alternative version of things. And by describing that alternative version, they are doing something more than describing. They are actively engaged in a political act. Rushdie continues. So literature can and perhaps must give the lie to official facts. But is this a proper function of those of us who write from outside India, or are we just dilettantes in such affairs because we are not involved in their day-to-day unfolding? Because by speaking out, we take no risks. Because our personal safety is not threatened. What right do we have to speak at all? Now here, Rushdie says that literature and writers have the task of giving the lie to official versions. Means Mrs. Gandhi, during the time of emergency and in the immediate aftermath of the emergency, projected herself as a firm believer in democracy. But her actions during the emergency actually were not in keeping with her professed belief in people's democratic rights. So we writers have to give the lie to such official versions. Give the lie എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ ഒരു പ്രയോഗമാണ്. അതിൻ്റെ അർത്ഥം എന്താണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അത് തെറ്റാണെന്ന് വിളിച്ചു പറയേണ്ടതുണ്ട്, അത് തെറ്റെന്ന് തെളിയിക്കുന്ന കാര്യങ്ങൾ പറയേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. And then he goes on to say, but is this the proper function of those of us who write from outside India? പക്ഷേ ഇത് ഇന്ത്യയിലിരിക്കുന്ന ആളുകളുടെ ജോലിയല്ല വേണ്ടത്, ഇന്ത്യയുടെ പുറത്ത് നിന്ന് എഴുതുന്ന ആളുകളുടെ, ഞങ്ങളെപ്പോലുള്ള ആളുകളുടെ ജോലിയാണോ ആവേണ്ടതെന്ന്. This is his doubt. Or are we just dilettantes in such a phase? Dilettantes means a person who displays, who exhibits a passing interest in something, who is not properly devoted to something, is a dilettante. For example, you can say he's a wealthy man, who collects a lot of books, but he's merely a dilettante, means he is not really interested in literature. In his study, he has a lot of books, but he is not really a committed student of literature. That is dilettantism also, you say, means your interest, you have some kind of, sort of, you're a dabbler in a field with no real commitment. That is dilettante. But or are we just dilettantes in such affairs because we are not involved in their day-to-day unfolding? Because by speaking out, we take no risk, because our personal safety is not threatened. What right do we have to speak at all? Now, this is a question he asks himself, because we, the writers, we are living in England, and we are not involved in the day-to-day politics that's unfolding in India. And we are also not putting our life on the line. And remember, he wrote this in 1982, and during 1977, means from 1975 to 77, I think, you had the emergency in India, and people who criticized the government were rounded up and taken to prisons. And a writer who is operating in Britain, of course, doesn't stand such risks. So what right he or she, operating in a foreign country, in a foreign language, has to comment on affairs in India? That's what he asked. Then again he goes on to say, my answer is very simple. Literature is self-validating. That is to say, a book is not justified by its author's worthiness to write it, but by the quality of what has been written. There are terrible books that arise directly out of experience, and extraordinary imaginative feats dealing with themes which the author has been obliged to approach from the outside. Now he says, literature is self-validating. Means the validity of literature lies in the literary product. It has nothing to do with the author's personal credentials. That's what Rushdie says. It might be a dubious claim. You might say that a person, who was a dictator writing a book supporting democracy might, and even if the end product, that the book itself is good, means, of course, it's not something, we approach without any kind of skepticism. So here, but Rushdie says that the book in itself is a self-validating artifact. That is to say, a book is not justified with its author's worthiness to write it. ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ അത് എഴുതാനുള്ള അർഹതയുടെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിലല്ല ഒരു പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ വില നിർണ്ണയിക്കുന്നത്. ബട്ട് ബൈ ദ ക്വാളിറ്റി ഓഫ് വാട്ട് ഹാസ് ബീൻ റിട്ടൺ. പക്ഷേ അയാൾ എഴുതിയതിൻ്റെ പ്രാധാന്യം അനുസരിച്ചാണ്. There are terrible books that arise directly out of experience. There are books, that arose directly out of experience. For example, a book like Primo Levi's Holocaust Experience, or Elie Wiesel's Night, which again narrates his Holocaust experience. There are books by the Palestinian authors. For example, a book like Mornings in Jenin by Susan Abul Hawa that narrates her tragic childhood in Palestine, in the occupied Palestine. So such books are books, they are terrible books. Terrible here also means terrific books, great books probably, that arose directly out of experience. But there are also books, that were extraordinary imaginative feats dealing with themes which the author has been obliged to approach from the outside. Imaginative feats എന്നാൽ ഭാവനയുടെ വ്യാപാരങ്ങളായിരുന്നു. പല പുസ്തകങ്ങളും ഭാവന, ഫീറ്റ്, FEAT മീൻസ് ഇറ്റ് വാസ് എൻ എക്സസൈസ്, എ ഗ്രേറ്റ് ഫീറ്റ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയും. ഗ്രേറ്റ് ഫീറ്റ് മീൻസ് ഇറ്റ്സ് എ ഗ്രേറ്റ് അച്ചീവ്മെൻറ്റ് എന്നുള്ള അർത്ഥത്തിൽ അത് വലിയ ഭാവനയുടേതായിരുന്നു. ഡീലിംഗ് വിത്ത് തീംസ് വിച്ച് ദ ഓഥർ ഹാസ് ബീൻ ഒബ്ലൈഡ് ടു അപ്രോച്ച് ഫ്രം ദ ഔട്ട്സൈഡ്. അത് എഴുത്തുകാരനായിട്ട് നേരിട്ട് ബന്ധമുള്ള അതേ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ ഭാഗമായിരുന്ന അനുഭവങ്ങളൊന്നുമല്ല പല പുസ്തകങ്ങളുടെയും തീമുകൾ. അപ്പം ബെഞ്ചമിൻ വിൽക്കോംസ്കിയുടെ ഫ്രാഗ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് എന്ന പുസ്തകം, ബെഞ്ചമിൻ വിൽക്കോംസ്കിയുടെ ഫ്രാഗ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് അദ്ദേഹം ആത്മകഥയായിട്ടാണ് എഴുതിയത്. പക്ഷേ അദ്ദേഹം കുറേ കാലത്ത് ആത്മകഥയാണെന്നുള്ളതൊക്കെ തന്നെ പറയുകയും ചെയ്തു. പിന്നെ വിൽക്കോംസ്കിയുടെ ഫ്രാഗ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് പിന്നീടാണ് കുറേ കാലത്തിന് ശേഷമാണ് അത് കെട്ടുകഥയാണെന്നും ഇദ്ദേഹം ആ കഥയിൽ പറഞ്ഞ ആളല്ല എന്ന് തെളിയുന്നത്. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് നെറ്റിൽ നോക്കിയാൽ ഫ്രാഗ്മെൻറ്റ്സിനെ പറ്റി കൂടുതൽ മനസ്സിലാക്കാം. എനിക്കിപ്പം സമയമല്ല. ബെഞ്ചമിൻ വിൽക്കോംസ്കിയുടെ ഫ്രാഗ്മെൻറ്റ്സ് എന്ന പുസ്തകം. Literature is not the business of copywriting certain themes for certain groups. And as for risk, the real risk of any artist are taken in the work, in pushing the work to the limits of what is possible, in the attempt to increase the sum of what is possible to think. Books become good when they go to this edge and risk falling over it, when they endanger the artist by reason of what he has or not artistically did. Again, the same theme. Rushdie goes on to say that a work is not to be judged by its author's merits or its author's credentials, whether he was a witness to or whether he was involved in what he is describing. We should approach a literary work as a self-validating artifact. And every literary work should try to push to the limits of experience, to give expression to the very limits of human experience. And sometimes it might even tip over. അനുഭവത്തിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും വലിയ സീമക്കപ്പുറത്തേക്ക്, സീമയുടെ ഏറ്റവും അപ്പുറത്തേക്ക്, അതിരുകൾക്കപ്പുറത്തേക്ക് പോവുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് സാഹിത്യകൃതികളുടെ ജോലി. ചിലപ്പോൾ അത് മറുകണ്ഠം ചാടിയെന്ന് വരും, ചിലപ്പോൾ അത് വീണെന്ന് വരും. ചെങ്കുത്തായ അനുഭവത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രതലങ്ങളിലേക്ക് നോക്കുമ്പോൾ അത് ചിലപ്പോൾ നിലം കിട്ടാതെ വീണെന്ന് വരും. പക്ഷെ അതാണ് സാഹിത്യകൃതിയുടെ ജോലി. അല്ലാതെ ഒരു സാഹിത്യകാരൻ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ അനുഭവമാണോ എഴുതുന്നത്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഭാവനയുടെ വ്യാപാരമാണോ അദ്ദേഹം കൃതിയിൽ നടത്തുന്നതെന്നല്ല കാര്യം എന്നാണ് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. So if I am to speak for Indian writers in England, I would say this, paraphrasing G.V. Deshani's H. Hatter, the migration of the 50s and 60s happened. We are here, and we are not willing to be excluded from any part of our heritage, which heritage includes both a Bradford-born Indian kid's right to be treated as a full member of the British society, and also the right of any member of this post-diaspora community to draw on its roots for its art, just as the world's community of displaced writers has always done. I'm thinking, for instance, of Grass's Danzig, Become Zank, of Joyce's Abandoned Dublin, of Isaac Bashevis Singer, Bashev Singer, and Maxine Hong Kingston, and Milan Kundera, and many others. It's a long list. Here the reference is to G.V. Deshani's book, All About H. Hatter, and it's a 1948 novel. And here he quotes the character H. Hatter, and who says we are here. Who says we are here. It's almost, an echo of what Salman Rushdie has written in Midnight's Children, I think, because there is a memorable sentence in Midnight's Children where he says, things happen thus because things happen thus, and what has happened cannot unhappen, something like that. So here, just like H. Hatter, what H. Hatter has said, we are here, means we, the exiles, we the writers, the migrant writers, are now part of England, and we claim ourselves to be heirs of both traditions, both the Indian tradition as well as the British tradition. So both these traditions belong to us, and we belong to both these traditions. So like other great migrant writers, for example, take the example of Grass. Grass means Günter Grass, the great German writer, whose Danzig means he has written Danzig trilogy, and he had later migrated to Poland. And James Joyce's Abandoned Dublin, you know about James Joyce, who lived as a migrant in Paris. And Isaac Bashev Singer and Maxine Hong Kingston is a Chinese writer, and Milan Kundera, is a Czech writer. These all writers were migrant writers. They left their home countries and lived in exile. And for all these writers, they were heirs of both the traditions, the tradition that they left behind and the tradition that they became part of. This is very much true of Indian writers living in England. That's what Rushdie here says. Let's carry on. Let me override at once the faintly defensive note that has crept into these last few lines. ഇവിടെ വന്നിരിക്കുന്ന കുറച്ച് പ്രതിരോധത്തിൻ്റെ അഥവാ ക്ഷമാപണത്തിൻ്റെ സ്വരം ഞാൻ ഒഴിവാക്കുകയാണ്. ലെറ്റ് മീ ഓവർറൈഡ്, അതിനെ മറികടക്കട്ടെ ഞാൻ. ഞാൻ അതിനെ മറികടക്കട്ടെ. ദ ഫെയിൻലി, നേരിയതെങ്കിലും ഡിഫെൻസീവ് നോട്ട്, അല്പം പ്രതിരോധത്തിലാണ് തോന്നുന്നത്. മീൻസ് വി ആർ റൈറ്റേഴ്സ് ഹിയർ ഹു ഹാപ്പൻ ടു ബി ഹിയർ. There is something that is slightly apologetic or defensive there. But let me override that and be a bit more assertive. The Indian writer looking back at India does so through guilt-tinted spectacles. I'm of course once more talking about myself. I'm speaking now of those of us who emigrated. Indian എഴുത്തുകാരൻ, അയാൾ വിദേശത്തെത്തിയിരിക്കുന്ന ഇന്ത്യൻ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ എപ്പോഴും തിരിഞ്ഞു നോക്കുന്നത് അല്പം guilt-tinted spectacles, അല്പം പാപബോധത്തോട്, കുറ്റബോധത്തോട്, because he has left his third world behind and has opted for the comforts of the first world. So he's always ridden with a sense of guilt. It's a kind of, guilt that trauma theorists talk about, that sort of survivor guilt. Means you and your friend were involved, for example, in a motorcycle accident. Your friend gets killed in the accident and you survive. Then you feel sort of guilty. That's called as kind of survivor guilt. Similarly, people who leave the third world behind and settle down in first world look back at their own country with guilt-tinted spectacles. Of course, Rushdie was not writing this during the time of the COVID pandemic. Now we read, of course, super rich Indians leaving this country in their private jets to rich countries. But this is something he wrote in 1982. But even then he says that the foreign writers, or Indian writers, who have settled down abroad always looks back with guilt-tinted glasses, spectacles. I'm speaking now of those of us who emigrated, and I suspect that there are times when the moves seem wrong to us all, when we see to ourselves post-lapsarian men and women. At times we feel like that we are fallen men and women. Post-lapsarian means after the fall. And after the fall refers to Adam's fall from heaven. We sometimes think that we have left the Elysium behind. We sometimes feel that we have left the paradise behind, or we have been exiled from the paradise. One second. We are Hindus who have crossed the black water. We are Muslims who eat pork. As a result, as we use of the Christian notion of fall indicates, we are now partly of the West. Our identity is at once plural and partial. Now he says that we are Hindus, means Hindu writers, those Hindu writers have crossed the black water, because in ancient Hindu belief, crossing the black water or crossing the sea was forbidden, especially for Brahmins. But the Brahmin writer who settles down in England has done the forbidden thing. Just as a Muslim writer who lives in the West eats pork, which is forbidden for Muslims. And we have thus become, like the fallen, Adam, which is a Christian image. So here he blends, all the plural images. One is drawn from Hindu belief, the other from Muslim belief, and the third one is from Christian belief. And he says that, his self and the self that the other writers, the other migrant writers possess, is very much a plural self. So he's always for plurality. And all postmodernists, remember, are for pluralism. Our identity is at once plural and partial. ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഐഡൻറ്റിറ്റി ഒരേ അവസരത്തിലൊരു ബഹുവചനമാണ്. അതേ അവസരത്തിൽ ഇത് വി ആർ പാർഷ്യൽ. വി ഹാവ് ഗോട്ട് ഹൈഫണേറ്റഡ് ഐഡൻറ്റിറ്റി എന്നാണ് അതിന് പറയാറുള്ളത്. ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഐഡൻറ്റിറ്റി എപ്പോഴും ഹൈഫണേറ്റഡ്. വി ആർ ഇന്ത്യൻ ബ്രിട്ടീഷ്, ഇന്ത്യ ബോൺ ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് റൈറ്റർ ഓർ ഇന്ത്യൻ അമേരിക്കൻ റൈറ്റർ. We can never be, Indian writers purely. Nor can we become purely American or British writers. Even, prescribing Rushdie, where we have to include him. It's always a question. Because if we consider him to be part of the Indian, canon, there will of course be questions. Isn't he a British who did much of his growing up in Britain and who is considered to be part of the British literary pantheon? Doesn't he possess a British passport? So there will always be such questions. Our identity is at once plural and partial. Sometimes we feel that we straddle two cultures. At other times that we fall between two stools. But however ambiguous and shifting this ground may be, it's not an infertile territory for a writer to occupy. ചിലപ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു രണ്ട് സ്റ്റൂളിൻ്റെ ഇടയിൽ പെട്ടു എന്ന്. ചിലപ്പോൾ അതിനെ രണ്ടിനെയും അതിജീവിക്കുന്ന, രണ്ടിൻ്റെയും അപ്പുറത്ത് പോകുന്ന. We straddle the seas, the continents. We can overreach both the continents. Sometimes, but we get the negative feeling. Sometimes we get the positive feeling that we straddle the continents, and sometimes we get the negative feeling that we have fallen between two stools. But for a writer, this is a fertile territory to occupy. ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം വിവിധ പാരമ്പര്യങ്ങളുടെ ഉൾക്കൊള്ളുക എന്നുള്ളത്, വിവിധ പാരമ്പര്യങ്ങളുടെ സമ്മിശ്രമായി കൊണ്ട് വർത്തിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത് ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരനെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം തീർച്ചയായും ഫലഭൂയിഷ്ഠമായ ഒരു കാര്യമാണ്. ഭാവനക്ക് വളരെ നല്ലതാണുള്ളത്. If literature is in part the business of finding new angles at which to enter reality, then once again our distance, our long geographical perspective may provide us with such angles. സാഹിത്യം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അറിയപ്പെടാത്ത അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പ്രതീക്ഷിക്കാത്ത കോണുകളിൽ നിന്ന് അനുഭവത്തിന് സമീപിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും സമീപിക്കാത്ത ഏതോ ഒരു പുതിയ കോണിൽ നിന്ന് അനുഭവത്തിന് സമീപിക്കുമ്പോഴാണ് എഴുത്തുകാരനാവുന്നത്. അതിന് തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും ഒരു പ്രവാസ ജീവിതം നയിക്കുന്ന എഴുത്തുകാരന് കഴിയുന്നു. കാരണം തൻ്റെ സമൂഹത്തെ പുതിയ ഒരു വീക്ഷണകോണിലൂടെ നോക്കാൻ ആൾക്ക് കഴിയുന്നു. ഓർ ഇറ്റ് മേ ബി ദാറ്റ് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് സിംപ്ലി ദാറ്റ് വി മസ്റ്റ് തിങ്ക് ഇൻ ഓർഡർ ടു ഡു അവർ വർക്ക്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ എന്താണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരേ പ്രദേശത്ത് തന്നെ ജീവിക്കുന്ന ഒരാൾ വളരെ സ്പോണ്ടാനിയസ് ആയിരിക്കും. പക്ഷെ ഒരു വിദേശ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ ഒന്നുകൂടി ചിന്തിച്ചതിന് ശേഷമായിരിക്കണം, ആലോചിച്ചെടുത്തതിന് ശേഷമായിരിക്കണം തൻ്റെ മാതൃദേശത്തെ പറ്റി എഴുതുന്നത്. അതും ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരന് പല നിലക്കും ഗുണമായി ഭവിക്കുന്നു എന്നാണ് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. Midnight's Children enters its subject from the point of view of a secular man. I am a member of that generation of Indians who were sold the secular ideal. മതേതരനായ ഒരാളുടെ കാഴ്ചപ്പാടിലൂടെയാണ് മിഡ്നൈറ്റ്സ് ചിൽഡ്രൻ അഥവാ അർദ്ധരാത്രിയുടെ പയ്യന്മാർ എന്ന നോവൽ ആ വിഷയത്തിനെ സമീപിക്കുന്നത്. ഞാൻ ഉൾപ്പെടുന്ന സമൂഹം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് റഷ്ദി പോസ്റ്റ് ഇൻഡിപെൻഡൻസ് സമൂഹത്തിലാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം ജനിച്ചത് 1947 ആ സമൂഹത്തെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് മതേതര സ്വപ്നം വിൽക്കപ്പെട്ടിരുന്നു. We were told that India is a secular country. We were told that our temples are not the temples where we worship the deities, but our temples are the dams, as Jawaharlal Nehru put it in his famous speech. And we were told that we had made a tryst with destiny. I was not raised in a narrowly Muslim environment. I do not consider Hindu culture to be either alien from me or more important than the Islamic heritage. I believe this has something to do with the nature of Bombay. അദ്ദേഹത്തിന് തന്നെ അനുഭവം പറയുകയാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം ഒരു മുസ്ലിം യാഥാസ്ഥിക കുടുംബത്തിലല്ല ജനിച്ചിരുന്നത്. ഹിന്ദു പാരമ്പര്യത്തിന് തുല്യ പ്രാധാന്യം കൽപ്പിച്ചിരുന്ന ഒരു സമൂഹത്തിലാണ്, ഒരു കുടുംബത്തിലാണ് അദ്ദേഹം ജനിച്ചത്. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഇത് ബോംബെ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ നഗരത്തിൻ്റെ പ്രത്യേകതയായിരുന്നു. ബോംബെ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞ നഗരം ഇറ്റ്സ് എ വെരി സിങ്ക്രറ്റിക് കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് എ സിറ്റി. ഒരിക്കൽ റഷ്ദി തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട് ബോംബെയിൽ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്ന ഭാഷ ഹഗ് മീ ആണെന്ന്. ഹഗ് മീ എന്ന് അദ്ദേഹം ആ ഭാഷയെ വിളിക്കാൻ കാരണം എന്താണ്? ഇറ്റ്സ് എ കോമ്പിനേഷൻ ഹി സെഡ് ഓഫ് ഹിന്ദി, ഉറുദു, ഗുജറാത്തി, മറാത്തി ആൻഡ് ഇംഗ്ലീഷ്. സോ ഇറ്റ്സ് ഹഗ് മീ. ഹഗ് മീ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞതിൻ്റെ അതേ അവസരത്തിൽ തന്നെ എന്നെ ഇംബ്രേസ് ചെയ്യുക എന്നുള്ള അർത്ഥമാണല്ലോ. ഇറ്റ് മീൻസ് യു ഇംബ്രേസ് മീ, കം ആൻഡ് ഇംബ്രേസ് മീ. Means Bombay has got this pluralistic tradition where everyone is embraced and none is rebuffed. I believe this has something to do with the nature of Bombay, a metropolis in which the multiplicity of commingled faiths and cultures curiously create a remarkably secular ambience. Salim Sinai makes use eclectically of whatever elements from whatever sources he chooses. കാരണം ബോംബെ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ പലതരത്തിലുള്ള ഒരു സെക്യുലർ ആംബിയൻസ് ആണ്. സലീം സിനായി ആവട്ടെ ഇതെല്ലാം തിരഞ്ഞെടുക്കുന്നത്, എക്ലക്റ്റിക് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ പലതിൽ നിന്നും തിരഞ്ഞെടുക്കുന്നതിന് നമ്മൾ എക്ലക്റ്റിക് എന്നറിയാം. നമ്മൾ പലപ്പോഴും പറയാറുണ്ട് എൻ്റെ അപ്രോച്ച് ഒരു എക്ലക്റ്റിക് അപ്രോച്ച് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു പ്രത്യേക അപ്രോച്ചല്ല. നമ്മൾ സാഹിത്യ പഠനത്തിൽ പോലും പലപ്പോഴും എക്ലക്റ്റിക് അപ്രോച്ച് എടുക്കാം. സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസത്തിൽ നിന്നും പോസ്റ്റ് സ്ട്രക്ചറലിസത്തിൽ നിന്നും മറ്റെല്ലാ സിദ്ധാന്തധാരകളിൽ നിന്നും മാർക്സിയൻ സിദ്ധാന്തധാരകളിൽ നിന്നൊക്കെ തന്നെ നിങ്ങൾ കടം കൊണ്ടുണ്ടാക്കുന്നത് യു സംടൈംസ് ബോറോ ഫ്രം മാർക്സിസ്റ്റ് സ്ട്രെയിൻ ഓർ എനി അതർ സ്ട്രെയിൻ ആൻഡ് യു ഫോളോ എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് എക്ലക്റ്റിക് critical practice. That is what you call eclectic. Of whatever elements from whatever sources he chooses, it may have been easier for his author to do this from outside modern India than inside it. So what Salim Sinai's author, the author of Midnight's Children, has done is, he too is eclectic like his protagonist. But more than his protagonist, there is Salim Sinai who lives in India. I as a person who resides abroad and who operates in a foreign language, am at a greater privilege, means I have a greater opportunity to experiment this multiplicity of voices. I want to make one last point about the description of India that Midnight's Children attempts. It's a point about pessimism. The book has been criticized in India for its allegedly despairing tone, and the despair of the writer from outside may indeed look a little easy, a little pat, but I do not see the book as despairing or nihilistic. Means many people criticized Midnight's Children, that's saying that it's very nihilistic. It has got a very pessimistic tone, because what happens means Salim Sinai's son, I think, whose name again is Adam Sinai, if I remember it rightly, you people might be remembering it because it's a prescribed text. What happens means he becomes deaf. He is not able to utter a word. Plus he is not able to dictate. His eyebrows don't move, his eyelids don't move. And he is born, as a kind of retarded child, as a challenged child. But that happens, his birth happens, I think, sometime during 1975, when the emergency was proclaimed in India. And in 1977, we see at the age of 2 or something, he suddenly starts uttering sounds. That means, emergency, the iron curtain of emergency has been lifted and there is fresh hope. So Rushdie, I think, here is true when he claims that book is not a pessimistic book. But many people, many critics attacked Midnight's Children, saying that it's a very nihilistic, very pessimistic kind of a book. And for a writer, he can easily afford to be nihilistic or pessimistic, especially when he is writing from abroad. This was one of the criticisms. The point of view of the narrator is not entirely that of the author. What I tried to do was to set up a tension in the text, a paradoxical opposition between the form and content of the narrative. The story of Salim does indeed lead him to despair, but the story is told in a manner designed to echo, as closely as my abilities allowed, the Indian talent for non-stop self-regeneration. He says that there is a tension in the story, means between the form and the content. The content is pessimistic. Salim Sinai's story in itself is pessimistic. But the form has been done, has been worked, has been crafted in such a manner that there is something optimistic about it. He says that India has this great power of continual regeneration. വീണ്ടും എത്ര തകർന്നാലും, എത്ര തകർക്കാൻ നോക്കിയാലും വീണ്ടും തളിരിടുന്ന, വീണ്ടും മുളപൊട്ടുന്ന ഇന്ത്യൻ സാന്നിധ്യമുണ്ട്, ഇന്ത്യൻ ശക്തിയുണ്ട്. ഇതാണ് മിഡ്നൈറ്റ്സ് ചിൽഡ്രൻ എന്ന കൃതി ഒരു നിലക്ക് ആവിഷ്കരിക്കാൻ നോക്കുന്നത്. അതിൻ്റെ പുസ്തകം, അതിൻ്റെ ഭാവവും ആ പുസ്തകത്തിലെ ഭാവനയും തമ്മിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആ പുസ്തകത്തിലുള്ള കഥയും തമ്മിൽ വ്യക്തമായൊരു സന്ത്രാസമുണ്ട് എന്നാണ് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. ദിസ് ഈസ് വൈ ദ നെറേറ്റീവ് കോൺസ്റ്റൻ്റ്ലി ത്രോസ് അപ്പ് ന്യൂ സ്റ്റോറീസ്, വൈ ടീംസ്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ആ കഥയിൽ ധാരാളം പുതിയ പുതിയ കഥകളുണ്ട്. നിങ്ങൾ നോക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഇപ്പോൾ അവസാനത്തിൽ ആദം സിനായി ആണെന്ന് തോന്നുന്നത്. ആദം സിനായിൽ നിന്നും തുടങ്ങി ആദം സിനായി തന്നെയാണ്. സലീം സിനായിയുടെ ഗ്രാൻഡ് ഫാദറിൻ്റെ പേരായിരുന്നു ആദം സിനായി, സലീം സിനായിയുടെ മകൻ്റെ പേരും ആദം സിനായി എന്ന് തന്നെയാണ് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നത്. ഏതായാലും ആദം സിനായിൻ്റെ ഓരോ കഥകളും ഓരോന്നാണ്. മീൻസ് ഹി ഹാസ് എ വെറ്റ് നേഴ്സ്, and the vet nurse, and more and more vet nurses had to be appointed because he had an insatiable appetite. ഇതിനെ മുലയൂട്ടാൻ ഒരാൾ മതിയാവുന്നില്ല. മുലയൂട്ടുന്ന നേഴ്സുമാരെ, ആയമാരെ ഒന്ന് പിന്നെ പിറകെ മറ്റൊന്നായിട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നു. ആൻഡ് ഹി ഹാഡ് എ കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് ടീത്ത് ദറ്റ് ഹി ബിറ്റ് ഓഫ് ദർ നിപ്പിൾസ്. ഇങ്ങനെ പല കഥകൾക്കകത്തുള്ള കഥകൾ. അത് പ്രധാനമായും പോസ്റ്റ് മോഡേൺ നോവലുകളുടെ പ്രത്യേകതയാണ്. അങ്ങനത്തെ ഒരു നോവലും ആണെന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ദിസ് ഈസ് വൈ ദ നെറേറ്റീവ് കോൺസ്റ്റൻ്റ്ലി ത്രോസ് അപ്പ് ന്യൂ സ്റ്റോറീസ് വൈ ടീംസ്. അത് നിറഞ്ഞ് കവിയുന്ന പുതിയ പുതിയ കഥകളുണ്ട്. ബോംബെ പോലെ തന്നെ കഥകളാൽ നിറഞ്ഞ് കവിയുന്ന ഒരു കഥാപുസ്തകമാണ് മിഡ്നൈറ്റ് ചിൽഡ്രൻ. ദ ഫോം മൾട്ടിറ്റ്യൂഡിനസ്. അതിൻ്റെ രൂപമാണെങ്കിൽ, കഥയുടെ രൂപമാണെങ്കിൽ, അതിൻ്റെ മൊത്തം ഘടന പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത് ധാരാളമാണ്. പല കഥകൾ കൂടിച്ചേരുന്ന ഒരു കഥയാണ്. ഹിൻഡിങ് അറ്റ് ദ ഇൻഫിനിറ്റ് പോസിബിലിറ്റീസ് ഓഫ് ദ കൺട്രി. നമ്മുടെ രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ അനന്തമായ സാധ്യതകൾ അത് സൂചിപ്പിക്കുന്നു. ഈസ് ദ ഓപ്റ്റിമിസ്റ്റിക് കൗണ്ടർ വെയ്റ്റ് ടു സലീംസ് പേഴ്സണൽ ട്രാജഡി. അത് ശുഭാപ്തി വിശ്വാസത്തിലാർന്ന സലീമിൻ്റെ വ്യക്തി എന്ന നിലക്കുള്ള ദുരന്തത്തിന് ഇവിടെ ഒരു ഓപ്റ്റിമിസ്റ്റിക് ആയ ഒരു കൗണ്ടർ വെയ്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടെന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. ഐ ഡു നോട്ട് തിങ്ക് ദറ്റ് എ ബുക്ക് റിട്ടൺ ഇൻ സച്ച് എ മാനർ ക്യാൻ റിയലി ബി കാൾഡ് എ ഡിസ്പെയറിംഗ് വർക്ക്. ആ രൂപത്തിൽ എഴുതപ്പെട്ട ഒരു കൃതി ഒരിക്കലും ഒരു നിരാശയുണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ഒരു പെസ്സിമിസ്റ്റിക്കായ വർക്ക് ആണെന്ന് വിളിക്കുന്നത് ശരിയില്ല എന്നാണ് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. എനിക്കും അത് തോന്നുന്നുണ്ട്. കാരണം എന്താ പറഞ്ഞാൽ ആദം സിനായി അടിയന്തരാവസ്ഥ കഴിയുന്ന സമയത്ത് പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും തന്നെ കൺപുരികങ്ങൾ ചലിപ്പിക്കുന്നു, ചിരിക്കുന്നു, ശബ്ദമുണ്ടാക്കുന്നു. അതുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഇന്ത്യയെ ഒരു സ്വച്ഛാധിപതിക്കും ഒരു കാലത്തും എന്നേക്കുമായി അടിച്ചമർത്താൻ കഴിയില്ല എന്നൊരു സന്ദേശമാണ് മിഡ്നൈറ്റ് ചിൽഡ്രൻ നൽകാൻ ശ്രമിക്കുന്നത്. England's Indian writers are by no means all the same type of animal. Some of us, for instance, are Pakistani, others Bangladeshi, others West or East, or even South African, and V.S. Naipaul by now is something else entirely. Now he continues to discuss this issue, means the issue confronting Indian writers living abroad. So he says that Indian writers, the species called Indian writer, they belong to different species, subspecies actually. They are not one type of animal. And animal is, a metaphor that Rushdie often uses. For example, somewhere he makes the famous quotation, there was no such beast before the midnight. Referring to India, he said that before the midnight there was no such beast called India. He doesn't say I don't remember the exact quotation. I think it is something like this. There was no such beast before the midnight, because the country called India as a geographical unity was not there before August 15, 1947. Before that, what you had was a lot of kingdoms, scattered into minor nawabdoms, and little maharajas ruled over different parts of India. And one of the curious things is that the Travancore Maharajas were against joining the Indian Union. There is something else. So I don't want to digress. But England's Indian writers, he says, are not one type of animal. They belong to various, by India he means the Indian subcontinent, which includes, of course, Pakistan, Bangladesh as well, and Bangladesh as well. So they belong to diverse countries, and also, they belong to either the west of India or the east of India. And some of those writers like V.S. Naipaul, they are not basically from India, though they are of the Indian stock. This word Indian is getting to be a pretty scattered concept. Indian writers in England include political exiles, first generation migrants, affluent expatriates whose residence here is frequently temporary, naturalized Britons, and people born here who may never have laid eyes on the subcontinent. Means they are a farrago. Farrago means a mixed lot. They are a farrago means they belong to all kinds of people. The people from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and also some who had never been to India. Some are of Indian origin, but they have never been to India because they were born and brought up in Britain. So there are naturalized Britons, means people who became British citizens. A naturalized Briton means one who becomes a British citizen. Sonia Gandhi, for example, is a naturalized Indian. She became an Indian citizen. And there are also, wealthy Indians who just spend part of their time in England and spend majority of the time in India. Clearly, nothing that I say can apply across all these categories. But one of the interesting things about this diverse community is that, as far as Indo-British fiction is concerned, its existence changes the ball game, because that fiction is in future going to come as much from addresses in London, Birmingham and Yorkshire as from Delhi or Bombay. So he says that you can't generalize across this spectrum, because this represents a veritable spectrum. People belonging to diverse nationalities, people of various ethnic origins can all be together categorized under the rubric called Indian English writers. But the thing is that in the future, the literature that is going to be, or the fiction that's going to be created by Indians living abroad, might as well be, or the so-called Indian English fiction might be one that might be produced in Yorkshire, in England, or in London, or in Glasgow, in Scotland, or it might be produced somewhere in Delhi or Bombay. All this will come under the rubric called Indian English fiction. Next paragraph. One of the changes has to do with attitudes towards the use of English. Many have referred to the argument about the appropriateness of this language to Indian themes. And I hope all of us share the view that we can't simply use the language in the way the British did, that it needs remaking for our own purposes. Those of us who do use English do so in spite of our ambiguity towards it, or perhaps because of that, perhaps because we can find in that linguistic struggle a reflection of other struggles taking place in the real world. Struggles between the cultures within ourselves and the influences at work upon our societies. To conquer English may be to complete the process of making ourselves free. Now he says, all these writers, whether they be writers of Indian origin who migrated from South Africa, or writers of Indian origin who migrated from Trinidad like Nepal, but all of them face this problem, means which language should they write, or is English an appropriate medium of expression for them? This question sooner or later they will have to confront. And of course, the English as the British use it won't be the language that will come in handy for them, that will suit their creative requirements. So what is to be done? Of course, conquering English is something, he says, is it going to happen? To conquer English may be to complete the process of making ourselves free. So he says that conquering English will be the process of making ourselves free. Means somewhere he, not in this particular essay, I think, but in another essay, means he talks about what is called a chutnification of English. That means, you have to mold English to suit your requirements. You shouldn't be speaking or writing English in the way the Britishers use or speak it, but you have to mangle English, if I can put it this, to suit our requirements, to fit in with our ethos. But the British Indian writer simply does not have the option of rejecting English anyway. His children, her children, will grow up speaking it, probably as the first language. And in the forging of a British Indian identity, the English language is of central importance. It must, in spite of everything, be embraced. The word translation. So he says that, but these writers have no other option, because his or her children will be growing up speaking English, and probably only English. And most likely English will be the first language. The mother tongue might be something else. So this is what happens in global villages. You will have one mother tongue, but your first language will be not be the same as your mother tongue. Your mother tongue might be Malayalam, but like Meena Alexander, you must have done your growing up somewhere else. And English, in all likelihood, will be your first language. So there's no option of saying goodbye to English and thinking of writing in your mother tongue, because you will not be at home in your so-called mother tongue. So that is always this problem. Now he goes on to talk something about translation, because of course writing in a foreign language about a culture that doesn't fit in with the ethos of that particular language is a kind of cultural translation. The word translation comes etymologically from the Latin of bearing across. Means he says that the word translation comes from the word bearing across in Latin. That means carrying across a river or somewhere. That is the etymological origin of the word translation. Etymology ആണ് വാക്കുകൾ എവിടെ നിന്നാണ് ഉത്ഭവിച്ചത് എന്നുള്ളത് കണ്ടുപിടിക്കുന്നതാണ് etymological origin. For example, many words have the same etymological root. For example, vazhi in Malayalam, vaya in English probably. So there are so many such things. Somedaya, suomoto, നമുക്ക് തോന്നും their etymological origins are the same. Having been born across the world, we are translated men. It is normally supposed that something always gets lost in translation. നമ്മളൊക്കെ എന്താ ഈ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ പോലുള്ള പ്രവാസി എഴുത്തുകാരെ ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് അദ്ദേഹം പറയാണ്, വി ഹവ് ബീൻ ബോൺ അക്രോസ് ദ ഷോർസ്, വി ഹവ് ബീൻ ടേക്കൺ ഫ്രം വൺ കൺട്രി ടു അനദർ കൺട്രി ആൻഡ് ഹെൻസ് വി ആർ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റഡ് മെൻ. ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് നിന്ന് മറ്റൊരു സ്ഥലത്തേക്ക് എത്തിക്കുക എന്നതാണ് ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ്റെ അർത്ഥമെങ്കിൽ തീർച്ചയായും ഞങ്ങൾ പരിഭാഷപ്പെടുത്തപ്പെട്ട ആളുകളാണ്. ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് നിന്ന് മറ്റൊരു സ്ഥലത്തേക്ക് വഹിക്കപ്പെടുന്നതിനാണെങ്കിൽ വി ആർ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റഡ് മെൻ. ആൻഡ് സംതിങ് ഈസ് ആൾവേസ് ലോസ്റ്റ് ഇൻ ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ. ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷനിൽ എന്തൊക്കെയോ നഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നുവെന്ന് എപ്പോഴും പറയുന്നതാണ്. ഈ ഇറ്റാലിയൻ ഭാഷയിൽ ഒരു പ്രയോഗം തന്നെയുണ്ട്, എന്താണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ട്രെഡിറ്റോർ എന്നെങ്ങാനുമാണ്. എന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ എ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റർ ഈസ് എ ട്രെയ്റ്റർ എന്നാണ്. ഒരു പരിഭാഷപ്പെടുത്തുന്നവനൊരു ചതിയനാണ്, ഒരു വഞ്ചകനാണ്. പരിഭാഷപ്പെടുത്തുമ്പോൾ പലപ്പോഴും നഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നതാണ്. പക്ഷേ റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത് പരിഭാഷപ്പെടുത്തുമ്പോൾ പലതും നഷ്ടപ്പെടുന്നതുപോലെ തന്നെ ശരിയാണെന്ത്, പരിഭാഷപ്പെടുത്തുമ്പോൾ പലതും കിട്ടുന്നു, പലതും ലഭിക്കുന്നു. ഐ ക്ലിങ് ഒബ്സ്റ്റിനേറ്റ്ലി, ഞാൻ വാശിയോടുകൂടി, ഒബ്സ്റ്റിനേറ്റ് മീൻസ് സ്റ്റബൺലി, ഞാൻ വാശിയോടുകൂടി ഈ വാദത്തിൽ ഉറച്ചു നിൽക്കുന്നു. ക്ലിങ് എന്നാൽ അതിനോട് തൂങ്ങുന്നു. ടു ദ നോഷൻ ദറ്റ് സംതിങ് ഈസ് ആൾസോ ഗെയിൻഡ്. ഇൻ ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ സംതിങ് മൈറ്റ് ബി ലോസ്റ്റ്, ബട്ട് സംതിങ് ആൾസോ യു മൈറ്റ് ഗെയിൻ. To be an Indian writer in this society is to face everyday problems of definition. ഈ സമൂഹത്തിൽ, ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് സമൂഹത്തിൽ ഒരു ഇന്ത്യൻ എഴുത്തുകാരനാവുക എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്നും നമുക്ക് നിർവചനത്തിൻ്റെ ഒരു സാധ്യതയെ അഭിമുഖീകരിക്കേണ്ടി വരുന്നു. ഇന്ത്യൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ, കാശ്മീരി ഇന്ത്യൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ. എപ്പോഴും ആർ യു, ഹു ആർ യു? ഐ എം എ റൈറ്റർ. വാട്ട് കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് റൈറ്റർ? എൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് റൈറ്റർ. എൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് റൈറ്റർ? ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് ഇറ്റ് സെൽഫ് മീൻസ് വൺ ഹു ഇസ് ബോൺ ഇൻ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട്. നോ, എൻ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് റൈറ്റർ. എൻ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് റൈറ്റർ. So there are always this problem of definition. What does it mean to be Indian outside India? How can culture be preserved without being ossified? ഇന്ത്യയുടെ പുറത്ത് ഒരു ഇന്ത്യക്കാരനാവുക എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എന്താണത്? സ്വാഭാവികമായിട്ടും ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റഡ് ആയ ഒരാൾ എന്തായിരിക്കും? ഹൗ ക്യാൻ കൾച്ചർ ബി പ്രിസേർവ്ഡ് വിത്തൗട്ട് ബീങ് ഓസിഫൈഡ്? ഓസിഫൈഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ എന്താ? എന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പുറ്റാകുന്നത് പോലെ. ശരിക്കും ഓസിഫൈഡ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പൂർണ്ണമായിട്ടും ഘനീഭവിച്ച പുതിയ മാറ്റങ്ങളൊന്നുമില്ലാത്തൊരു രൂപമാണ് ഒസിഫൈഡ് ട്രഡീഷൻസ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയും. കാലഹരണപ്പെട്ടതിനും പറയും. ഒസിഫൈഡ് ആവുക എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ പിന്നീട് മാറ്റങ്ങളൊന്നുമില്ലാതെ ആവാതെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമുക്ക് നമ്മുടെ സംസ്കാരത്തെ മാറ്റങ്ങൾ കൂടാതെ നിലനിർത്താൻ കഴിയും? സംസ്കാരം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ എപ്പോഴും രണ്ട് പ്രക്രിയകൾക്ക് വിധേയമാണ്. ഒരു കൂട്ടർ അതിനെപ്പോഴും പഴയ കാലത്തിൻ്റേതുപോലെ തന്നെ അതിൻ്റെ തനിമയിൽ നിലനിർത്താൻ ശ്രമിക്കും, മറ്റൊരു കൂട്ടർ അതിനെ മാറ്റാൻ ശ്രമിക്കും. ഇങ്ങനെ പരിവർത്തനത്തിനും സ്ഥായീഭാവത്തിനും ഇടയിലാണ് എപ്പോഴും സംസ്കാരങ്ങൾ സ്ഥിതി ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഹൗ ഷുഡ് വി ഡിസ്കസ് ദ നീഡ് ഫോർ ചേഞ്ച് വിത്തിൻ അവർ സെൽസ് ആൻഡ് അവർ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി വിതൗട്ട് സീമിങ് ടു പ്ലേ ഇൻ ടു ദ ഹാൻഡ്സ് ഓഫ് അവർ റേഷ്യൽ എനിമീസ്? നമ്മുടെ വംശീയ ശത്രുക്കളുടെ ആഗ്രഹത്തിനനുസരിച്ച് നിൽക്കാതെ എങ്ങനെ നമുക്ക്, ഹൗ ഷുഡ് വി ഡിസ്കസ് ദ നീഡ് ഫോർ ചേഞ്ച്? നമുക്ക് മാറ്റത്തെക്കുറിച്ച് എങ്ങനെ ചിന്തിക്കും? ബിക്കോസ് ഇഫ് യു ട്രൈ ടു ഇമിറ്റേറ്റ് ദ ബ്രിട്ടീഷ് ആൻഡ് ഇഫ് യു ട്രൈ ടു സ്പീക്ക് ലൈക്ക് ദ ബ്രിട്ടീഷ്, യൂസ് ദർ ലാംഗ്വേജ്, what you are doing, you are becoming traitors to your own culture. You are betraying your own culture and you will be playing into the hands of your conquerors. How can you preserve your culture? You have to preserve your culture, but at the same time you have to preserve it in an alien language. This is the challenge that the migrant writers face. What are the consequences, both spiritual and practical, of refusing to make any concession to the Western ideas and practices? പടിഞ്ഞാറൻ ആശയങ്ങൾ അതിന് യാതൊരു നിലക്കുള്ള വിട്ടുവീഴ്ചയും ചെയ്യാതെ, മീൻസ് യു ഡോണ്ട് ട്രൈ അറ്റ് ആൾ ടു imitate the Westerners, and you don't buy their ideals, their principles. You try to stay away from their language. But what are going to be the consequence of that? These questions are all a single existential question. How are we to live in the world? So this is all part of a single existential question. How can we live in this world that is shifting? It's not the old world where you had insular communities. Insular communities were enclosed communities whose culture was well preserved because there was very little cultural traffic that took place. And it's only to preserve the culture that in ancient times it was said that a Brahmin is not supposed to cross the sea. Crossing the sea would pollute him. Means, of course, you come in contact with the alien culture, and that will certainly contaminate you, and you will certainly be susceptible to cultural influences. And this was why sea travel, crossing the sea, was forbidden for Brahmins. So here in the flux of times, when there's a lot of give and take, how will you be able to preserve your culture without betraying your culture? I do not propose to offer prescriptively any answer to these questions. ഒരു ഡോക്ടറെ പോലെ പ്രിസ്ക്രിപ്ഷൻ കൊടുക്കാൻ പറ്റില്ല. ഇതിനൊക്കെ എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു ഡെഫിനറ്റീവായ ഉത്തരം ഉണ്ടെന്ന് ഞാൻ പറയുന്നില്ല എന്ന് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. Only to state that these are some of the issues with which each of us will have to come to terms. നമ്മൾ ഓരോരുത്തരും ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തെ പോലുള്ള എഴുത്തുകാർ, വിദേശത്തെ പ്രവാസി എഴുത്തുകാർ ഓരോരുത്തരും പലപ്പോഴായും അഭിമുഖീകരിക്കേണ്ടി വരുന്ന പ്രശ്നങ്ങളാണെന്നല്ലാതെ ഈസ് നോട്ട് ഗോയിങ് ടു പ്രിസ്ക്രൈബ് എ solution, a formula that can solve all these problems, all these issues that confront a writer in exile. This is what he says. Rushdie continues, to turn my eyes outwards now and to say a little about the relationship between the Indian writer and the majority white culture in whose midst he lives, and with which his work will sooner or later have to deal. Now, so far Rushdie had been talking about the foreign writer's relationship to his home country. Now he says that he has to say something about the migrant writer's relationship to his host country. So there is always this conflict, this tension involving the host country and the home country. So what about his relationship, his equation with the host country? That's what he is going to discuss in the next few paragraphs. In common with many Bombay-raised middle-class children of my generation, I grew up with an intimate knowledge of and even sense of friendship with a certain kind of England. A dream England composed of test matches at Lord's, presided over by the voice of John Arlott, at which Freddie Truman bowled unceasingly and without success at Polly Umriger. Now he talks about his childhood in Bombay, and like all Bombay children, he too had a dream England in his mind much before he actually set foot in England. This is true of all of us, especially people like us who are doing English literature. We have an image of England, probably not the real England, but a dream image of England very much in our minds. It's, where we have Shakespeare, where we have London with all its greatness, its bewildering, it's bewildering kind of confusion and everything. Means Dr. Johnson had famously said about London that one who is tired of London should be tired of life. So we have, our own mental pictures of England. And Rushdie says, as a child growing up in Bombay, he too had attended an English school, and he too had these romantic notions about England, which was about cricket, which was about Lord's cricket ground, known to be the Mecca of cricket, where there were these, people bowling, and many of them were imaginary characters, as he goes on to say. And presided over by the voice of John Arlott. John Arlott, we should imagine that he was a cricket commentator. It doesn't matter much who he is. At which Freddie Truman bowled unceasingly, means unstoppingly, and without success at Polly Umriger and Enid Blyton and Billy Bunter. Enid Blyton, you all know, is a famous writer who mainly wrote for children. She was born in late 19th century and lived till I think more than the middle of the mid 20th century, more than the middle of 20th century, and she's written a lot of books for children, and still she's a great favorite for children, and millions of copies of her book has been sold. And Billy Bunter is a character. So his England was composed of all these colorful characters. It was not the true England, but it was an England of the fictional landscape. It was an England of idyllic dreams. It was an England full of cricket, full of joy, full of those great characters that peopled his childhood that he spent in Bombay. Enid Blyton and Billy Bunter, in which we were even prepared to smile intelligently at portraits such as Hari Jamshed Ram Singh. Hari Jamshed Ram Singh, understand, is a character in one of these stories. I think in the story that he mentioned, that Billy Bunter stories, you have this character, Hari Jamshed Ram Singh, the dusky Nabob of Banipur. Nabob actually is Nawab. Means, he's a mixed character. He's a mix of everything. Means mix of, for example, he's Hari Jamshed Ram Singh. He's part Hindu, part Muslim because he's a Nawab, and he's even Sikh because he's a Singh. So for him, England was composed of these multiple images, images which he drew from various fiction and the things that he heard on the radio. In fact, television was not there in Bombay at that time. I wanted to come to England. I couldn't wait. And to be fair, England has done all right by me. But I find it a little difficult to be properly grateful. Means then I wanted to come to England because my childhood was peopled by all these wonderful English characters and this wonderful English landscape. Means I desperately wanted to come to England. I yearned to come to this land. But somehow, for some reason or other, I can't be properly grateful to this host country. Now, he says why. I can't escape the view that my relatively easy ride is not the result of the Dream England's famous sense of tolerance and fair play, but of my social class, my freak fair skin, and my English accent. Take away any of these, and the story would have been very different. Because of course the Dream England is no more than a dream. Now he says England has been kind to him. Means in English society, in his host country, he had found himself at home. But somehow he is not in a position to be grateful. Why? He says his right into the English society, or his amalgamation with the English society, was perfect and was probably very smooth. But the reason for that, he says, is one, his freak fair skin. Though an Indian, he is a Kashmiri, and Kashmiris, we know, they generally have a fairer complexion compared with the rest of us, especially compared with the Dravidian people, with we people who belong to South India. And being a Kashmiri, being fair-skinned, and since his accent was English, means he didn't speak English like other Indians. He was educated in Bombay, but it was in a convent school, and his English accent didn't give him away. Give someone away എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഒരാൾ പറയുന്നത് കേട്ടാൽ അയാൾ മനസ്സിലായാൽ ഇന്ത്യക്കാരനാണെന്ന്. His accent gave him away. Means immediately I could know that he was from Thrissur. Her accent, or his accent, gave him away. My ride in English society was smooth. My amalgamation with the English people was smooth and seamless, because probably it owes much to my freak white skin, to my English accent. If any of this had been different, and also to my class, he says, he belongs to the upper class, and he was put in a school for the elite. And if he had been a person who belonged to the lower class, if his accent had been very much Indian, and if his skin was not as fair as it was, probably his amalgamation with the British would not have been such a smooth affair. And so he has got this feeling that despite being accepted in the English society, he remains a foreigner there. And because he nurses this feeling, because he harbors this feeling, he has not been able to reciprocate England's hospitality as is due. Sadly, it's a dream from which too many white Britons refuse to awake. Recently, on a live radio program, a professional humorist asked me, in all seriousness, why I objected to being called a walk. Now, actually, the dream England, he says, is only a dream England. It's said that English people are tolerant. It's said that English people are very cosmopolitan in outlook. They can, accept people from all countries, all continents. But he says, in my case, this owes to my fair skin, to my upbringing, to my belonging, to the fact of my belonging to the upper class, and to my English accent. But this won't be true for everyone. And actually, it's not the much trumpeted English tolerance that is responsible for my being accepted as a member of this society. Recently, he says that in a radio program, he was asked why he objected to being called a vogue. A vogue, is a person who is a non-Britisher or who is a non-white. It's a slang for non-white people, especially Asians. They call them vogues. I don't know whether you remember. In God of Small Things, we came across this word when Sophie Moll first met Esther and Rahel. She said, "You are vogues and I am a half vogue." So W-O-G, it's a racist term. Many people consider it offensive. And this this humorist went on to say what? Let's see. He said he had always thought it a rather charming word, a term of endearment. I was at the zoo the other day, he revealed, and a zookeeper told me that the walks were best with the animals. They stuck their fingers in their ears and wiggled them about, and animals felt at home. The ghost of Hari Jamshid Ram Singh walks among us still. So the radio humorist, the professional humorist, he went on to say that vogue was an affectionate term, a term of endearment. And why should you object to such a term? And he also said that vogues were the kindest people, according to a zookeeper whom he met. And the zookeeper said what the vogues do, people of Asian origin do. They visit the zoo and they affectionately fondle the animals. Sometimes they even insert their fingers in the animals' ears and wiggle them there. Probably, to tickle them, or probably, for example, if it's a monkey or something, or, to clean its ear. That's how vogues are. Isn't it in a term of endearment? പക്ഷേ എൻഡിയർമെൻറ്റിൻ്റെ ടേംസ് പലപ്പോഴും പലർക്കും ഇഷ്ടപ്പെടില്ല എന്നുള്ള. നിഗർ എന്നുള്ള നമ്മൾ സ്നേഹത്തിലായിരിക്കും ചിലപ്പോൾ ഒരു കറുത്തവനെ വിളിക്കുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ കറുത്തവർക്ക് അത് ഇഷ്ടപ്പെട്ടോളണമെന്നില്ല. പല വാക്കുകളും അങ്ങനെയാണ്. അത് നമുക്ക് എൻഡിയർമെൻ്റ് ആയി തോന്നും. ബോയ് എന്നുള്ള വാക്ക് സാധാരണ കറുത്തവരെ വിളിക്കാൻ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. ബട്ട് ബ്ലാക്സ് ഒബ്ജക്റ്റ് ടു ബീങ് കോൾഡ് ബോയ് ബിക്കോസ് ദേ സേ ദാറ്റ് ഇറ്റ് അമൗണ്ട്സ് ടു infantilizing them. As Richard Wright found long ago, Richard Wright, understand, is a famous black American writer. I got it wrongly when I told you that Richard Wright was the guy who wrote Invisible Man. I don't know how come I committed such a mistake. I do remember, because The Invisible Man is a novel written by Ralph Ellison, and it's a wonderful novel. Ralph Ellison's The Invisible Man. Richard Wright is a very famous, black American writer who has written a lot about issues related to race and all. As Richard Wright found long ago in America, black and white descriptions of society are no longer compatible. കറുത്തവരും വെളുത്തവരും അമേരിക്കയിൽ വിവരിക്കുന്ന വിവരണങ്ങൾ അത് രണ്ടും കോമ്പാറ്റിബിൾ അല്ല, പരസ്പരം ചേരുന്നതല്ല. നേരത്തെ തന്നെ ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞു ഈ ജെയിംസ് വിറ്റ്ഫീൽഡിൻ്റെ ഒരു കവിത, അത് ഞാൻ ആളെ ഉദ്ധരിച്ചപ്പോൾ തെറ്റിപ്പോയെന്ന് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു. ഞാൻ റിച്ചർഡ് റൈറ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞെന്ന് തോന്നി. ജെയിംസ് വിറ്റ്ഫീൽഡിന് അറിയപ്പെടുന്ന കവിത എങ്ങനെയാണ് തുടങ്ങുന്നത്? ഓ അമേരിക്ക, ദൗ ബോസ്റ്റഡ് ലാൻഡ് ഓഫ് ലിബർട്ടി, ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ടു ദീ ഐ റേസ് മൈ സോങ്, ദൗ ലാൻഡ് ഓഫ് ബ്ലഡ് ആൻഡ് റോങ് ആൻഡ് ക്രുവൽറ്റി. ഇത് ജെയിംസ് വിറ്റ്ഫീൽഡ് ആട്ടോ എഴുതിയത്. ഞാൻ നേരത്തെ റിച്ചർഡ് റൈറ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഐ എം സോറി. മീൻസ് O America, thou boasted land of liberty, it is to thee I raise my song, thou land of blood and wrong and cruelty. So see, that's the American blacks version of America. They don't think, America is all compassionate. It's a profoundly compassionate country, a very Christian country that embodies the Christian values. That's not how blacks perceive America to be. Even recently you had the George Floyd incident, and the kind of protests that it sparked worldwide. and the protest movement, crystallized, means in the movement called the Black Lives Matter. So blacks perceive an America that is different from the America perceived by the whites. As Richard Wright found long ago in America, black and white descriptions of society are no longer compatible. Fantasy, or the mingling of fantasy and naturalism, is one way of dealing with these problems. It offers a way of echoing in the form of our work the issues faced by all of us. How to build a new modern world out of an old legend-haunted civilization, an old culture which we have brought into the heart of the newer one. Here the solution for the writer, for the migrant writer, says Rushdie, is to use what he says fantasy. Means fantasy is imagination, and in fantasy, unlike usual imagination, in fantasy you can have supernatural creatures. For example, even in the novel Midnight's Children, you can see Salman Rushdie employs fantasy. For example, Salim Sinai has got telepathy gifts. He can communicate with other children who were born at the time of the midnight in 1947 on August 15, without the aid of any mobile phones. Of course, you didn't have mobile phones then. Without the aid of any telephones, without the help of any other kind of device, because he has got the telepathy gift. And there's a lot of fantasy there. Besides that, he has got a nose. He's said to be a kind of olfactory genius. Olfactory genius means one who has wonderful power of smell. And because of this, he was used by the army during the war, because he could smell things. So there he deploys fantasy. So here he says the writer operating means or the migrant writer writing or operating in exile abroad, who has the difficult task of trying to write about a culture, about a host culture that is sometimes hostile, and whose that at least the writer finds to be incompatible with the mainstream description, will have to blend, will have to use fantasy as well as naturalism. Naturalism means realism. Actually, fantasy and naturalism are not compatible, but the writer operating in the postmodern milieu will have to use these incompatible means for his craft. That's what Rushdie here says. It offers a way of echoing in the form of our work the issues faced by all of us. How to build a new modern world out of an old legend-haunted civilization. Legend-haunted, ഇതിഹാസങ്ങൾ വേട്ടയാടുന്ന ഒരു പഴയ നാഗരികതയും പുതിയ ലോകവും തമ്മിൽ ഇങ്ങനെ ബന്ധിപ്പിക്കാമെന്ന വലിയ പ്രശ്നമാണ് എഴുത്തുകാർ ഇവിടെ അഭിമുഖീകരിക്കുന്നത്. ഇപ്പം നിങ്ങൾ ലെജൻഡ്സ് ഓഫ് കസാക്ക് വായിച്ചിരിക്കും. അതിൽ പലപ്പോഴും ഇതിഹാസങ്ങളാണുള്ളത്. ഇതിഹാസങ്ങളുടെ ലോകത്തിലേക്ക് എത്തുന്ന രവി അവിടെ ആധുനികതയുടെ പ്രതിനിധിയായിക്കൊണ്ടാണ് രവി അവിടെ എത്തുന്നത്. രവിക്കും ഇതേ പ്രശ്നം തന്നെയാണുള്ളത്. അദ്ദേഹം മദ്രാസ് ക്രിസ്ത്യൻ കോളേജിലൊക്കെ പഠിച്ച, ആധുനിക വിദ്യാഭ്യാസം ശ്രദ്ധിച്ച, യാഥാർത്ഥ്യത്തിൻ്റെ ലോകത്ത് അഥവാ ശാസ്ത്രത്തിൻ്റെ ലോകത്ത് ജീവിക്കുന്നൊരു മനുഷ്യനാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം അഭിമുഖീകരിക്കുന്ന വളരെയധികം ഇതിഹാസങ്ങൾ, ഷെയ്ഖുകൾ, ഇഫ്രീത്തുകൾ, ജിന്നുകൾ, അതുപോലെ കുറേ ഇതിഹാസങ്ങളിലൊക്കെ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്ന ഒരു ജനതയാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ഇതേപോലുള്ള ഒരു വെല്ലുവിളിയാണ് ഇവിടെ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ, ലെജൻഡ് ഹോണ്ടഡ് ആയ ഒരു സിവിലൈസേഷനായിട്ട് വരുന്ന എഴുത്തുകാരൻ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ട് പോലുള്ള ഒരു യൂറോപ്യൻ പാശ്ചാത്യൻ ദേശത്ത് നേരിടുന്നതെന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. But whatever technical solutions we may find, Indian writers in these islands, like others who have migrated into the north from the south, are capable of writing from a kind of double perspective. പക്ഷേ ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള എഴുത്തുകാർക്ക് ഒരു ദ്വിദൃഷ്ടിയുടെ, ഇരട്ട ദൃഷ്ടിയുടെ ആനുകൂല്യം ഉണ്ടാവും എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. രണ്ട് ദൃഷ്ടിയുടെ ആനുകൂല്യം ഉണ്ടാവും എന്നാണ് പറയുന്നത്. കാരണം അവർക്ക് രണ്ട് നാടുകളിൽ നിന്നുള്ള കാഴ്ച ഉണ്ടാവുന്നുണ്ട്. This is something the metropolitan writer doesn't have. This is a privilege that only the migrant writer has. Because we are at one and the same time insiders and outsiders in this society. ഈ സമൂഹത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ ഒരേ അവസരത്തിൽ ഇൻസൈഡേഴ്സ്, because we are British citizens, we speak English, we write in English, and for us English is almost like our mother tongue. But at the same time we are outsiders thanks to our origin. This stereoscopic vision is perhaps what we can offer in place of whole sight. Stereoscoping എന്ന് ഒരു തരം പ്രത്യേക കണ്ണടക്ക് ഉപയോഗിച്ചുണ്ടാക്കുന്ന ഒരു 3-dimensional kind of view ആണ്. Means it gives depth and a feeling of 3-dimensionality to 2-dimensional pictures. If you go to an optometrist, there they will have some kind of you can check the net for a kind of stereoscope. Means it gives you an illusion of 3-dimensionality. It's that illusion of 3-dimensionality that the writer operating abroad or the Indian writer based in England can offer, instead of the whole picture or the whole sight about which John Fowles had said in his novel. Rushdie continues, and this is the last section. There is one last idea that I should like to explore, even though it may, on first hearing, seem to contradict much of what I have said so far. It is this: of all the many elephant traps lying ahead of us, the largest and most dangerous pitfall would be the adoption of a ghetto mentality, to forget that there is a world beyond the community to which we belong. To confine ourselves within narrowly defined cultural frontiers would be, I believe, to go voluntarily into that form of internal exile, which in South Africa is called the Homeland. We must guard against creating, for the most virtuous of reasons, British Indian literary equivalents of Botswana or the Transkei. Now he says something that, by his own admission, probably contradicts what he has been saying so far. He says that despite the fact that Indian writer living abroad, writing in a foreign language, he earlier said, will have the benefit of double vision, because he or she is a heir of two cultures. But at the same time, he says that these writers should guard themselves against being ghettoized. To be part of a ghetto means to be part of a minority, underprivileged community, and to retain your cultural practices without fully amalgamating or assimilating with the dominant culture. That is being a ghetto. Among South Africans who live outside South Africa, they call this the homeland kind of a complex. Means you live probably in England or in America or in any European country, but you live as an Indian there without fully amalgamating yourself with the host culture, with the dominant mainstream culture. Means you maintain your own unique ways, your own native rituals, your native lifestyle, and you always remain apart from the mainstream. Instead of being a part of it, you remain apart. A part and apart. This is not Rushdie, I'm saying. Means you should fully, it seems the message here is that one should always be part of, or one should act as if one is part of the larger community. That's what Rushdie says. അപ്പം റഷ്ദി ഇതുവരെ പറഞ്ഞതിൽ നിന്ന് അല്പം വ്യത്യസ്തമായിട്ട് തോന്നാം എന്ന് റഷ്ദി എന്നെ പറയുകയാണെന്ത്, ഒരു ഇന്ത്യൻ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഏഷ്യൻ എഴുത്തുകാരൻ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിലോ അമേരിക്കയിലോ ആൾ ജീവിക്കുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അയാൾ ആ സമൂഹത്തിലൊരു ഗെറ്റോ മെൻറ്റാലിറ്റിക്ക് അടിമപ്പെട്ടത്. ഗെറ്റോ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒരു വലിയ സമൂഹത്തിൽ ജീവിക്കുന്ന പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഒരു പ്രത്യേക തെരുവുകളിലോ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഉള്ള പ്രദേശങ്ങളിലോ ജീവിച്ച് സ്വന്തമായ സാംസ്കാരിക തനിമ നിലനിർത്തുകയും അവിടുത്തെ ഡൊമിനൻ്റായ അവിടുത്തെ മുഖ്യധാര സംസ്കാരവുമായിട്ട് പൂർണ്ണമായും ലയിക്കാതിരിക്കുകയും ചെയ്യുന്ന ആളുകളെയാണ് ഒരു തരത്തിലുള്ള ഗെറ്റോ മെൻറ്റാലിറ്റിക്ക് അടിമപ്പെട്ടവരെന്ന് നമ്മൾ പറയാറുള്ളത്. ആ രൂപത്തിൽ ഗെറ്റോ മെൻറ്റാലിറ്റിക്ക് അടിമപ്പെടരുത് എന്നാണ് ഇവിടെ റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. പിന്നെ അങ്ങനത്തെ സമൂഹങ്ങൾ പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും ലണ്ടനകത്ത് തന്നെ അത്തരത്തിലുള്ള ആഫ്രിക്കക്കാരുടെ പല സമൂഹങ്ങളുണ്ട്. അതാണ് അദ്ദേഹം പറയുന്നത്. അവർ ബോത്സ്വാന ഓർ ട്രാൻസ്കി, ഇതൊക്കെ ആഫ്രിക്കൻ സ്ഥലങ്ങളുടെ പേരാണ്. ഇതുപോലെയുള്ള അവിടെ ലണ്ടനകത്ത് ഒരു ബോംബെ ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ലണ്ടനകത്ത് ഒരു ചെന്നൈ ഉണ്ടാക്കുക, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു കൊച്ചി ഉണ്ടാക്കുക. അവിടെ ഒരു ഗെറ്റോ ആയി മാറുന്ന അവസ്ഥ ഉണ്ടാവരുതെന്നാണ് റഷ്ദിയുടെ വാദം. ദിസ് റൈസസ് ഇമ്മീഡിയറ്റ്ലി ദ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ഓഫ് whom one is writing for. My own short answer is that I write that I have never had a reader in mind. I have ideas, people, events, shapes, and I write for those things and hope that the completed work will be of interest to others. But which others? In the case of Midnight's Children, I certainly felt that if its subcontinental readers had rejected the work, I should have thought it a failure, no matter what the reaction in the West. So I would say that I write for the people who feel part of the things I write about, but also for everyone else whom I can reach. Now this, of course, Rushdie says, this stance that he has taken, that a migrant writer living in the metropolis shouldn't succumb to the temptation of being ghettoized, or shouldn't succumb to the temptation of being part of a ghetto, being apart from the dominant culture. But at the same time, Rushdie says, this will inevitably raise the question for whom one is writing. And Rushdie has his answers. He says that when he thinks of something, he writes of that something without having a reader in mind. I think this statement by Rushdie has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because critics have accused Rushdie of writing predominantly for a white audience. And one critic has even said, I think it is Makaran Paranchpe, I'm not very sure, has said that Rushdie always wants to gain admission to the proverbial Jack's garden. Jack is a common English name. Means he wants his work to be applauded by the Britishers. And in his works, India is portrayed always in negative light, because he wants the white man's applause. This is one of the criticisms against Rushdie. Though Rushdie here maintains that he doesn't write with a white reader in mind, there are critics who say that he always has the white audience in his mind. For example, you remember that famous scene in Midnight's Children where we have, I think, Nadir Shah, the poet. I'm not sure of the name. I read it a couple of years back. So the character Nadir Shah, or somebody, who is chased by a mob, and he runs, of course, and then he seeks shelter in somebody's bathroom, and he just knocks the door open, and it was locked, but the lock gives way, it breaks, and he is able to find refuge inside, means for the angry marauding mass. But the reason why the lock broke was written on the lock itself, is what Rushdie says, because the reason written was made in India. So this instance itself shows how Rushdie tries to portray India in negative light. So there are critics who say that Rushdie often writes with the Western audience in mind. So whatever that, here Rushdie says that he doesn't write with a particular audience in mind. But he also says that if Midnight's Children, whose subject matter is India, whose locale is India, was rejected by the readers in the subcontinent, he would have felt the work itself to be a failure. So I would say that I write for the people who feel part of things I write about, but also for everyone else whom I can reach. Means primarily, he says he is writing, for example, if it's Midnight's Children, since the locale is India and Indians are part of the landscape of the novel, his primary audience, he says, are Indians. But as I said, you can question his claim here. But he also says that it's not only Indians, but any writer, or any reader who he can reach. In this, I am of the same opinion as the black American writer Ralph Ellison, who in his collection of essays, Shadow and Act, says that he finds something precious in being black in America at this time, but that he is also reaching for more than that. I was taken very early, he writes, with a passion to link together all I loved within the Negro community and all those things I felt in the world which lay beyond. So in this, he says, in this respect, Rushdie says that he has a lot of affinity. Means he feels at one with the black American writer Ralph Ellison, who is the author of The Invisible Man and who is a very famous Afro-American novelist. He said that what Ralph Ellison said is that he tries to link everything that is black, means all the ethos of the black culture. He tries to bring in all that in his work, but not exclusively black. Those things that are beyond the black culture, beyond the black civilization, those things also he tries to bring in his work. And Rushdie says he too tries to link in that is everything Indian and also tries to explore that is beyond Indian. Let's carry on. Rushdie continues, art is a passion of the mind, and the imagination works best when it is most free. Western writers have always felt free to be eclectic in their selection of theme, setting, form. Western visual artists have in this century been happily raiding the visual storehouse of Africa, Asia, the Philippines. I am sure that we must grant ourselves an equal freedom. Unquote. Now Rushdie here says, at least in this we have to copy the Western writers. Means at least in this, the Western writers should be our model, because Western writers freely raid other cultures for inspiration. For example, Western painters, they've drawn inspiration from not only from Western tradition but also from the African, the Asian, the Filipino tradition. All these traditions have influenced 20th century Western painting. And Indian and subcontinental writers too should give themselves this kind of freedom, because we should be eclectic and we should be able to draw inspiration from multiple sources. Let me suggest that Indian writers in England, he continues, let me suggest that Indian writers in England have access to a second tradition, quite apart from their own racial history. It is the cultural and political history of the phenomenon of migration, displacement, life in a minority group. We can quite legitimately claim as our ancestors the Huguenots, the Irish, the Jews. The past to which we belong is an English past, the history of immigrant Britain. So he says that, the migrant writers living in West have a great tradition and have a lot of experiences to count on. Means, for example, they have the experience of migration, they have the experience of living as a marginalized community, as members of a marginalized community in a dominant mainstream culture. So all these experiences they can draw on, and they've got their ancestors in other people who migrated like that. For example, the Irish and the Jews. The Jews, were a scattered people. The very word diaspora actually comes from the Jewish experience of being dispersed, of being scattered across the world. The word diaspora was itself first used to mean the Jewish communities who were scattered in Western metropolitan centers. So similarly, the Asian writer too can draw inspiration from the experience of people like the Irish and the Jews and the Huguenots. And the Huguenots, remember, they were French Protestants who were exiled. France was and is still a mainly Catholic country. And there were a lot of crusades against Protestants. Protestants were killed en masse. Means a lot of genocides were there against Protestants. Even, a saintly figure like Ignatius Loyola was responsible for the genocide of countless Protestants. So they had to seek refuge in other countries, in countries like England. So he says that we can trace our ancestry, our spiritual ancestry. The Indians or the Pakistani writers living outside, means living in England, can trace their spiritual ancestry to such groups as the Jews, as the Huguenots, and as the Irish. The past to which we belong is an English past, the history of immigrant Britain. Our past, the past to which we immigrants belong, is the past of the immigrant Britain. Britain itself, as a country, has played host to diverse waves of immigrants. And we are part of that huge tradition, that long tradition stretching back into history. Swift, Conrad, Marx are as much our literary forebears as Tagore or Ramon Roy. So there were such great writers like Joseph Conrad, who was a Polish immigrant to Britain and who learned English only at the age of 21. So there were such writers like even Marx. He was a German Jew who was exiled. So we can trace our lineage to such great figures as much as we can trace our roots to Tagore or Ram Mohan Roy. We are part of a huge, tradition, a great tradition. That tradition also, encompasses their great voices, the great migrant voices like Joseph Conrad, like Jonathan Swift, and like Marx. American National of Immigrants has created a great literature out of the phenomenon of cultural transplantation, out of examining the ways in which people cope with a new world. It may be that by discovering what we have in common with those who preceded us into this country, we can begin to do the same. Now he cites the example of the United States. The United States is a country of migrants, emigrants, people who came from different parts of the world. For example, there is in American literature, there's a Jewish tradition, there's a powerful East European tradition. Writers as recent as Jonathan Safran Foer, they represent the East European tradition. There's an Anglo-American tradition, probably the dominant tradition. There's an Asian American tradition, there's an Arab American tradition. So American culture has been enriched. American literature has been enriched by the contributions made by these diverse groups of immigrants. Similarly, Britain too, British literature too, can count on the contributions of writers from various parts of the British Empire who have now settled in England. I stress this is only one of the many possible strategies, but we are inescapably international writers at a time when the novel has never been a more international form. A writer like Borges, Borges, speaks of the influence of Robert Louis Stevenson on his work. Heinrich Ball acknowledges the influence of Irish literature. Cross-pollination is everywhere. I think now what Rushdie goes on to say is that this is only one of the strategies, means you can trace your tradition to that of the migrant writers who enriched the British literature, like Swift, like Marx, like Joseph Conrad. But there might also be other strategies, he admits. But at the same time, he goes on to stress the nature of novel. Means novel now, he says, is an international art form, is a transnational art form. Because in a world characterized by migrations, by translocation, it's the most popular literary genre, that is novel, will certainly be reflecting these tendencies. It's a very international kind of art form. That's why a writer like Borges, who is an Argentinian or a South American writer, talked about the influence on his works of Robert Louis Stevenson, who is an 19th or 18th century British writer. And also there is a writer like Heinrich Ball who admits the influence of Irish literature. Cross-pollination, അങ്ങോട്ടും ഇങ്ങോട്ടുള്ള പരാഗണം എന്നാണ്. പോളിനേഷൻ എന്ന പരാഗണം, പരസ്പരം ഈ പല സാഹിത്യങ്ങൾ, നമ്മളിപ്പം മലയാള സാഹിത്യത്തിനെ കുറിച്ച് തന്നെ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, സച്ചിദാനന്ദൻ്റെ കവിതകളെ പറ്റിയൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ, ഒരുപക്ഷെ ഇംഗ്ലീഷ് സാഹിത്യം ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മറ്റ് സാഹിത്യധാരകളില്ലെങ്കിൽ സച്ചിദാനന്ദനെ പോലുള്ളൊരു കവി മലയാളത്തിൽ ഉണ്ടാവുമായിരുന്നില്ല. അപ്പോൾ സാഹിത്യം എന്താണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ പരസ്പര പരാഗണത്തിൻ്റെതാണ് സാഹിത്യം, ക്രോസ് പോളിനേഷൻ്റേതാണ്. And it's perhaps one of the most pleasant freedoms of the literary migrant to be able to choose his parents. My own selected, half consciously, half not, include Gogol, Cervantes, Kafka, Melville, Machado de Assis. ഒരു സാഹിത്യകാരൻ്റെ, ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും വലിയ സ്വാതന്ത്ര്യം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ he can choose his parents. Parents here means the literary parents, the spiritual parents. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്വാധീനം എവിടെ നിന്നുള്ളത് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ തന്നെ തീരുമാനിക്കാം. റഷ്ദി പകുതി ഹൃദയത്തോടു കൂടി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്വാധീനങ്ങളായിട്ട്, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ സ്പിരിച്വൽ ഫാദേഴ്സ് ആയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അദ്ദേഹം തിരഞ്ഞെടുക്കുന്നത് റഷ്യൻ എഴുത്തുകാരനായ ഗൊഗോളാണ്, സ്പാനിഷ് എഴുത്തുകാരനായ സെവാൻഡസ് ആണ്, കാഫ്ക മെൽവിൽ. കാഫ്ക ഈസ് ദ ഓസ്ട്രിയൻ റൈറ്റർ, ദ മെൽവിൽ, മച്ചാഡോ ഡി അസ്സി. അപ്പം പല കാലഘട്ടങ്ങളിലുള്ള പല പ്രദേശങ്ങളിലുള്ള എഴുത്തുകാരെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് നിങ്ങളുടെ സ്പിരിച്വൽ ആത്മീയ പിതാവായിട്ട് എടുക്കുക എന്നുള്ളത് ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ ഒരു ഭാഗ്യമാണ്. എ പോളിഗ്ലോട്ട് ഫാമിലി ട്രീ. പോളിഗ്ലോട്ട് മീൻസ് a person who speaks many languages is a polyglot. But here a polyglot means his influences, his spiritual fathers, means his parents, spiritual parents, he says, is a polyglot family tree. Means they are writers who speak diverse languages, Spanish, Russian, German, and so many different languages, against which I measure myself and to which I would be honored to belong. I don't measure myself to a single family tree, means a family tree that is monochromatic. Instead, I measure myself against a polyglot family tree, and my parents are diverse. I don't belong to one particular father. My spiritual fathers, my spiritual gurus are too many, and they speak diverse languages. So here again he stresses the point that in translation something might be lost. In translation and translocation something might be lost, but a lot is gained. There is a beautiful image in Saul Bellow's latest novel, The Dean's December. The central character, the Dean, Corte, hears a dog barking wildly somewhere. He imagines that the barking is the dog's protest against the limit of the dog's experience. അപ്പോൾ സോൾ ബെല്ലോ ഹിസ് എ നൊബൽ പ്രൈസ് വിന്നിങ് അമേരിക്കൻ ജൂയിഷ് റൈറ്റർ. അദ്ദേഹത്തിൻ്റെ ഏറ്റവും അവസാനം എഴുതിയ കൃതികളിലൊന്നായിട്ട് പറയുന്നത് ദ ഡീൻസ് ഡിസംബർ എന്ന പുസ്തകത്തിൽ ഒരു ഇമേജ് ഉണ്ട്. അവിടെ എന്താണ്, ഒരു നായ എങ്ങനെ വെറുതെ കുരക്കുന്നു, ഉച്ചത്തിൽ കുരക്കുന്നു. എന്തിനാണ് നായ കുരക്കുന്നതെന്ന് അറിയില്ല. അപ്പോൾ അതിന് സോൾ ബെല്ലോ കൊടുക്കുന്ന വ്യാഖ്യാനം എന്താണെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ, നായയുടെ പരിമിതിയെ അതിലംഘിക്കാനുള്ള കുരയാണ്. എന്നാൽ നായക്ക് നായത്വം എന്നൊരു പരിമിതിയുണ്ട്, അതിലംഘിക്കുക. എല്ലാ എഴുത്തുകാരുടെയും ലക്ഷ്യം റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നതനുസരിച്ച് സ്വന്തം പരിമിതികളെ, സ്വന്തം ഭാഷയുടെ പരിമിതികളെ, സ്വന്തം പ്രദേശത്തിൻ്റെ പരിമിതികളെ, സ്വന്തം പാരമ്പര്യത്തിൻ്റെ പരിമിതികളെ, ഇതിനെയെല്ലാം ഉല്ലംഘിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എല്ലാ എഴുത്തിൻ്റെയും എല്ലാ കലയുടെയും ലക്ഷ്യം. സോൾ ബെല്ലോയുടെ ഡീൻസ് ഡിസംബറിൽ ആ നായ കുരക്കുന്നത് എന്തിനാണെന്ന് വെച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ, ബെല്ലോ പറയുന്നുണ്ട് എന്താണ്, is against the limit of the dog experience. For God's sake, the dog is saying, open the universe a little more. And because Bello is of course not really talking about dogs or only about dogs, I have the feeling that the dog's rage and its desire is also mine, ours, everyone's. For God's sake, open the universe a little more. പ്രപഞ്ചം തന്നെ കുറച്ചും കൂടി, ലോകത്തിനൊന്നും കൂടി തുറന്നു കൊടുക്കുക. നമുക്കെല്ലാവർക്കും നമ്മുടെ ലിമിറ്റേഷൻസിനെ, നമ്മളെ എല്ലാവരെയും ചില തരത്തിലുള്ള ചങ്ങലകൾ ബന്ധിപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ട്. നിങ്ങൾ പിന്നീട് പോർട്രേറ്റ് ഓഫ് ദ ആർട്ടിസ്റ്റ് ആസ് എ യങ് മാൻ എന്ന ജെയിംസ് ജോയ്സിൻ്റെ ഉജ്ജ്വലമായ നോവൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് 4th സെമസ്റ്ററിൽ പഠിക്കാൻ. അതിലൊരു തീം എന്താണെന്ന് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ, ഒരു എഴുത്തുകാരൻ എല്ലാ നിലക്കുള്ള ബന്ധനങ്ങളെ, മതത്തിൻ്റെ, ജാതിയുടെ, രാജ്യത്തിൻ്റെ, ഭാഷയുടെ, ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള എല്ലാ ബന്ധനങ്ങളെയും വിച്ഛേദിക്കുന്ന ഘട്ടത്തിലാണ് അയാൾ യഥാർത്ഥ എഴുത്തുകാരനാവുന്നതെന്നും അയാൾ ഇതിഹാസങ്ങളിൽ പറഞ്ഞിരിക്കുന്ന ഡെഡാലസിനെ പോലെ സ്വാതന്ത്ര്യത്തിൻ്റെ വിഹായത്തിലേക്ക് സ്വതന്ത്രമായി പറക്കാൻ കഴിയുക എന്നുള്ളതുമാണ് ആ പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ, ആ നോവലിൻ്റെ ഒരു പ്രധാനപ്പെട്ട തീമായിട്ട് വരുന്നത്. പറക്കൽ എപ്പോഴും അതിൽ തീമാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെയാണ് അതിൻ്റെ നായിക കഥാപാത്രത്തിൻ്റെ പേര് തന്നെ ഡെഡാലസ് എന്നാണ്. ഇതുപോലെ തന്നെയാണ് ഇവിടെയും പറയുന്നത്, നായക്ക് നായയുടെ പരിമിതിയെ ഉല്ലംഘിക്കേണ്ടതുപോലെ തന്നെ എഴുത്തുകാർക്ക് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ പരിമിതി ഉല്ലംഘിക്കേണ്ടതുണ്ട്. മൈഗ്രൻ്റായ പ്രവാസികളായ എഴുത്തുകാർക്ക് ഇതിന് കൂടുതൽ സൗകര്യമുണ്ട്. അവരെ സംബന്ധിച്ചിടത്തോളം ഇമാജിനറി ഹോംലാൻഡ്, ഭവനം എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ലോകമാണ്. ലോകത്തിൻ്റെ പല ഭാഷ സംസാരിക്കുന്ന, പല അതിരുകളിൽ താമസിക്കുന്ന, പല പ്രദേശങ്ങളിൽ ജീവിക്കുന്ന ആളുകളിൽ നിന്ന് അവർക്ക് പല രൂപത്തിലുള്ള സ്വാധീനങ്ങൾ ലഭിക്കുന്നു. ഈ സ്വാധീനങ്ങളെല്ലാം അവരെ ഒരർത്ഥത്തിലുള്ള ഗോഡ് ഫാദേഴ്സിനെ നിർണ്ണയിക്കുന്നു. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ അവർക്ക് പല രൂപത്തിലുള്ള സ്വാധീനങ്ങളിൽ നിന്ന് അവർക്ക് പ്രചോദനം ഉൾക്കൊള്ളാൻ കഴിയുന്നതെന്നാണ് റഷ്ദി പറയുന്നത്. അതാണ് സോൾ ബെല്ലോയുടെ നായ പറയുന്നത്, ഓപ്പൺ ദ യൂണിവേഴ്സ് എ ലിറ്റിൽ മോർ. അത്ര തുറന്നാൽ നമുക്ക് പിന്നെ വീണ്ടും തുറക്കേണ്ടി വരും. നമ്മൾ കൂടുതൽ ഭൂമിയെ തുറക്കുക, മനസ്സിലാക്കാൻ കഴിയാത്ത ഭൂമിയെ തുറക്കുക, പ്രപഞ്ചത്തിൻ്റെ രഹസ്യങ്ങളെപ്പറ്റി ഭാവനയിൽ സങ്കല്പിക്കുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എഴുത്തുകാരൻ്റെ ധർമ്മം എന്നാണ് ഇവിടെ റഷ്ദി